Why does Romeo and Juliet still break the world? The psychology of forbidden love opening Verona. One July night sometime in the 1590s, in a cold stone tomb lit only by torchlight, a young girl lies still, as if asleep. 14 years earlier, she was born into the wealthiest family in Verona. 14 years later, she lies here beside a young man who has also just died. Not from illness, not from old age, but from a decision the two of them made only hours before. Better to die together than live without each other. The smell of poison still hangs in the air. Outside the tomb, footsteps are running closer, a little too late for what they'd hoped. And if you pause right there, not the moment after, once everyone already knows how it ends, but that exact moment, you'll see two families who have hated each other for generations standing side by side for the first time. Not to fight, but to look together at what their hatred has done. You've probably heard this story 100 times. In a textbook, in a movie theater, in some song that happened to come on at a cafe while your mind was somewhere else. The two names have become common nouns in nearly every language on Earth. Cafes are named after them. A bronze statue of them stands in an Italian city that millions of tourists line up to touch every year, as if touching it makes it real. People send each other quotes from this story on anniversaries, write them on wedding cards, tattoo lines from it onto their skin, and almost none of those people, if you stopped them and asked, could tell you what the story is actually warning them about. There's one question almost nobody ever stops to ask carefully. Why? Why does a story that ends in two deaths, a story that, if it happened to someone you actually knew, you'd call a terrible tragedy, a warning to tell your children, something people would only bring up in a lowered voice and a sad look? Why has humanity, across 400 years, dozens of languages, and hundreds of translations, called this the greatest love story ever written? That's not a rhetorical question meant to open the video for effect. That's the question we're going to carry all the way to the end. And the answer, once you hear it, might make you look at your own relationship differently, or at the relationship of a friend you've been worried about, a child hiding a romance, a sibling in love with someone the whole family is against. Because the answer isn't in Verona, and it isn't in the 16th century. It's sitting in a psychology study published in 1972. It's on a terrifyingly high suspension bridge in Canada, where a team of researchers waited for men to walk across it, just so they could ask a question that, on the surface, has nothing to do with love at all. It's in a set of identification papers, a mother in southern Vietnam confiscated from her daughter to force her to give up the man she loved. And it's sitting in your own brain right now. As you listen to this, whether you're in love, have been in love before, or are thinking about someone you've never quite let yourself call love. Let me say this clearly up front, so none of us misunderstand each other along the way. This is not a literature lecture about Shakespeare. This is not an endorsement of loving someone so hard that you ignore every piece of advice the adults in your life are giving you. This is not a suggestion that being forbidden is some necessary spice for a passionate love. This is the decoding of a real psychological mechanism, one that is running right now in the mind of anyone who has ever loved a person that someone else, a parent, a society, a circumstance, told them they shouldn't. Once you understand that mechanism, you'll have something Romeo didn't have, something Juliet didn't have, something a lot of people out there right now don't have either. The ability to tell the difference between a fire that's genuinely worth keeping alive and a fire that's only burning that bright because someone is trying to put it out. 14. That's how old Juliet is when the story begins. By any modern standard, a child, not yet old enough to be making a decision that will shape the rest of her life. That's exactly part of the problem, and we'll come back to it later when we look directly at a society that once treated this as completely normal. But don't rush to put this story in a box just because of her age. Because what makes this mechanism worth paying attention to isn't age at all. It's the fact that it can happen to anyone at any age. To a 26-year-old bank employee we'll meet later in this video, to a 24-year-old woman whose own extended family turns its back on her, to a couple married 15 years who never faced a single obstacle and quietly wonder why the spark feels gone, to someone in their 40s starting over after a divorce and falling for exactly the kind of person their friends are warning them against, to someone in their 60s. This mechanism doesn't care how old you are or how much money you have, and it doesn't care whether you're living in 16th century Verona or in a city somewhere in the world this year. It cares about exactly one thing. Is someone trying to stop you? Chapter 1: A party in Verona. Let's go back to Verona one more time, slower this time. Before it was a tragedy, this was just a party, a Capulet family party, loud and crowded, lit by candlelight and wine. A young man from House Montague, the Capulets' sworn enemy, sneaks in for one reason only: to catch a glimpse of a different girl he's hopelessly infatuated with. He has no intention of falling for anyone else that night. That's the first thing almost every film adaptation never quite tells you straight. Before he ever meets Juliet, Romeo is already heartbroken over someone else, a girl named Rosaline, about whom he's written dozens of mournful little poems. He shows up to that party with a broken heart, dragged along by a friend who just wants him to get his mind off her for a while. And then he sees Juliet standing across the room in the candlelight. Hold on to that moment. It's going to come back later under a completely different scientific name. Nobody in that room knows in that exact second that they are witnessing the beginning of one of the most studied psychological effects in the entire history of the science of love, an effect that, almost 400 years later, scientists will name after the two of them, and will go on to prove with numbers, with surveys that ran for months at a time, that what happened in that room wasn't some random fairy tale. It's a pattern, one that may very well be running through your own life, or the life of someone you know right now. And here's the part no one tells you straight when they retell this as a simple romance. If House Montague and House Capulet didn't have that generations-old blood feud. A feud so old that by this point neither family even remembers exactly how it started. There's a real chance Romeo and Juliet would have just been a short, intense summer fling, burning hot for a few weeks, and then fading the way millions of young romances have faded before, with nobody remembering their names. Nobody writes a play about that. Nobody casts a bronze statue for that. It's the hatred itself, the obstacle that seemed like it could only bring pain, that turned one summer fling into an immortal legend. Here's what most couples miss when they look back on their own relationship. They remember the most intense period of being in love, and that period, more often than not, also happens to be the period with the most obstacles in the way. They confuse the intensity of that feeling with the actual quality of the relationship itself. They start believing that the more it hurts, the harder it is, the more valuable that love must be. And quietly, that belief has pulled no small number of people into relationships they couldn't bring themselves to leave, because the sheer intensity of the feeling convinced them this had to be the real thing. You'll see this exact pattern again later, wearing a completely different costume. In Vietnam, in a story just as ancient, just as bloody, and built on strikingly the same formula. A young woman, a young man on the opposing side, and a tragedy an entire nation still argues about thousands of years later, tucked into school textbooks you may have studied without ever realizing it was describing the very thing we're about to decode. But before we get there, there's one thing you need to carry with you through the rest of this video. In 1972, a team of psychology researchers in the United States did something nobody had ever done before. They found 140 real couples actually in love, actually living their lives, and asked them very specific questions, repeated over and over across several months. They weren't looking for Romeo and Juliet in a book. They were looking for Romeo and Juliet walking down the street, sitting in a coffee shop, arguing with their parents about who they loved, right there in America in the early 1970s. What they found would permanently change the way psychology understood forbidden love. But that same finding, more than 40 years later, would get a major question mark put right next to it by a completely different group of researchers. A twist almost nobody knows about, including the people quoting this effect online every single day. We'll get there, just not yet. One more thing before we begin. On the other side of the world from Verona, hundreds of years before Shakespeare ever picked up a pen, a different people once told a strikingly similar story about a princess. A magic crossbow, a young man carrying a mission he himself didn't fully understand, and an ending the Vietnamese people are still arguing about generations later. Was it a love story to be pitied, or a bitter lesson about the cost of loving the wrong person, at the wrong time, on the wrong side? You'll meet them in a moment. And on the other side of the world from both of them, in the deserts of ancient Arabia, a poet lost his mind over a woman he was forbidden to marry, and left behind a name that still means obsessive love in half a dozen languages today. You'll meet him too. Now come with me back into that party at Verona, where a young man has just laid eyes on a girl in the candlelight, and neither of them has any idea they're about to write a story that will still be told long after the two of them, after all of us sitting here today, are gone. The night before everything changes, Juliet is sitting in her room and her mother is telling her she's getting married. Not you might get married someday. Not we should start thinking about it. Her mother walks in with the nurse, sits her down, and tells her there's a wonderful man named Paris, well-connected, good-looking by every account, and he wants to marry her. The wedding will be soon. This isn't a question. Nobody in that room is waiting for Juliet's opinion the way you'd wait for an answer. They're waiting for her to say yes, because saying no was never really on the table. Watch the nurse in this scene, because she's doing something almost every well-meaning relative does without realizing it. She isn't cruel. She loves Juliet genuinely, has raised her since infancy, would defend her against almost anything. But she also can't stop talking about how handsome Paris is, how lucky Juliet is, how a girl her age should already be thinking about marriage and children. Every word is meant kindly. Every word also makes it a little harder for Juliet to say what she's actually feeling, which is nothing close to excitement. Her mother asks, almost as an afterthought, whether Juliet thinks she could love him. It's the only question in the entire conversation that sounds like it's asking about Juliet's inner life rather than her usefulness to the family's social standing. And even that question already assumes the answer should be yes. She manages something polite. She says she'll look at him tonight at the party and try to like what she sees. That's the most agency she's been given in this entire conversation. Permission to try to feel something for a man chosen for her. Now hold that feeling. Hold the loneliness of being a teenager whose future just got decided in a 5-minute conversation by people who love her, technically, but have never once treated her like someone whose preferences matter. Because in just a few hours, a stranger is going to climb over a wall into her family's garden and ask her what she actually wants. Maybe for the first time in her life, anyone has asked her that question and actually waited for the answer. That's not romantic framing for its own sake. That's the exact ingredient psychologists would later go looking for, decades down the line, when they tried to explain why forbidden love hits so much harder than love nobody has a problem with. We'll get to the science of it soon. For now, just notice the shape of it. A girl with no say in her own life, about to meet a boy who for the first time seems to be asking instead of deciding for her. The party happens. You already know how it starts from Romeo's side. A heartbroken boy crashing a party he wasn't invited to, just to catch a glimpse of someone else. What you may not know is what happens on Juliet's side of that same room. She notices him before anyone introduces them. She asks the nurse who he is, trying to sound casual about it and failing. And when the nurse tells her, when Juliet finds out the boy she just noticed is a Montague, the one family her entire household has been raised to despise, something strange happens. She doesn't stop noticing him. If anything, the noticing gets sharper, more urgent, harder to look away from. Write that down, because it matters more than almost anything else in this chapter. The information that should have ended her interest is the exact information that intensified it. Not later, immediately, before they've even spoken a single word to each other. There's someone else watching that same room, and his reaction tells you exactly how dangerous this attraction actually is. Juliet's cousin, Tybalt, spots Romeo across the party and recognizes him instantly. His first instinct isn't suspicion, it's rage. He wants to draw his sword right there in the middle of his own family's celebration and kill a Montague for the crime of standing in the room. It's only Lord Capulet himself, Juliet's father, who stops him not out of any goodwill toward Romeo, but because killing a guest, even an uninvited one, during his own party would humiliate the family in front of half of Verona. Tybalt backs down. He doesn't forget, remember, his name, because it's going to come back later, and when it does, it's going to cost someone a life that should never have been lost. This is the air Romeo and Juliet are breathing when they speak to each other for the first time. Not a neutral room where two strangers happen to meet, but a room where one of her own blood relatives is, at that exact moment, restraining himself from killing him on sight. Later that night, after the party ends and the guests go home, Romeo doesn't leave. He climbs the wall into the Capulet orchard, alone at night, in enemy territory, for a girl he's spoken to maybe twice. If anyone in that house finds him there, the family's history together tells you exactly how that ends. And it isn't with a polite conversation. Tybalt, who just hours ago wanted to draw a sword over Romeo's mere presence in a crowded room, is somewhere inside that same house, asleep, unaware that the boy he wanted to kill is now standing under his cousin's window in the dark. Romeo knows the risk. He climbs the wall anyway and stands there afterward, not saying anything at first, just watching a lit window, the way people do when they're not entirely sure yet what they're going to say, only that they couldn't make themselves go home. Then Juliet appears at her window above the garden, thinking she's alone, and, believing no one can hear her, says his name out loud into the night air, followed by a question that's been asked in 1,000 classrooms in 1,000 different tones, almost always without anyone explaining what it actually means. Why does he have to be the one person out of everyone in Verona who belongs to the one family she's forbidden to love? She isn't asking it as a riddle to be solved. She's asking it the way you ask a question when you already suspect there's no good answer, and you're hoping out loud anyway that maybe there is. Romeo, hiding below, hears every word. What follows is one of the most quoted conversations in the history of the English language, and almost nobody who quotes it stops to notice how strange it actually is, once you take the poetry away and just look at the behavior. Two teenagers who met for the first time a few hours earlier are now in the dark, in secret, talking about forever, not about getting to know each other, not about whether this even makes sense practically, given that their families would rather see each other dead than see the two of them together. About forever, about marriage. Juliet, to her credit, is the more cautious one in this exchange, at least at first. She's the one who points out that this is moving impossibly fast, that he barely knows her, that swearing love after a few hours of acquaintance is the kind of thing that sounds wonderful in the moment and foolish by morning. She says it almost like a warning to herself as much as to him, the way a person talks themselves through a decision they've already half made and are only pretending to weigh. And then, within the same conversation, she agrees to marry him anyway, in secret, within days, without either family knowing. Why would someone who clearly understands how reckless this is do it regardless? It's worth sitting with that question rather than rushing past it, because the easy answer, because it's true love, is exactly the answer the rest of this video is going to take apart, piece by piece. True love, the kind that lasts decades, the kind researchers can actually measure in stable, long-married couples, is not built in a single moonlit conversation between two people who've exchanged maybe 40 sentences total. Something else is happening here, something fast and powerful enough to override her own stated caution within minutes of stating it. She isn't lying when she says this is too fast. She means it, and she still says yes. Both things are true at once, and that contradiction is not a flaw in the writing. It's the entire mechanism we're here to decode, captured in a single conversation 400 years before anyone had the scientific vocabulary to explain what was actually happening to both of them. In that garden, at night, with the clock running out before someone discovers Romeo doesn't belong there. Notice too what's almost completely absent from this exchange. Time to simply be bored together, to argue about something small, to see each other on an ordinary day with nothing at stake. Every single minute they've spent in each other's company has happened under threat. The threat of being caught, the threat of violence, the threat of a clock that might run out before dawn. They have no idea yet that this is exactly the kind of soil in which infatuation grows fastest and deepest, and most dangerously mistakes itself for something it hasn't had time to become. By morning, a plan exists that didn't exist 12 hours earlier. A secret wedding, arranged through a sympathetic friar, hidden from two families who would tear the city apart if they found out. Romeo goes straight from that garden to the friar's small stone cell and asks him to marry them that same day, in secret. The friar's first reaction is closer to disbelief than approval. Only days earlier, he was listening to this same young man cry over a completely different girl. And now here he is, asking to be married urgently to someone he met the night before. He says as much out loud, almost scolding him for how quickly his heart seems to change direction. And then he agrees anyway, not because he's been talked out of his own doubts, but because underneath the lecture, he sees something he's wanted for years without ever finding a path toward it. A way to end the feud between Montague and Capulet, two families whose hatred has cost this city more than either side seems willing to admit. If their children are married quietly, and the truth comes out later, maybe it forces the two houses to finally make peace instead of burying another son. He isn't only marrying two teenagers in love, he's making a calculated bet, using their relationship as the instrument for something he cares about, far more than either of their individual happiness. Two people who, by any reasonable measure, barely know each other, are about to be made legally bound for life, built on a handful of stolen hours in the dark, and one older man's hope that it might fix something much bigger than either of them. Hold on to this feeling, the urgency, the secrecy, the sense that every minute together is borrowed time that could run out. Because it's going to reappear later in this video, wearing a lab coat instead of a doublet, on a bridge in Canada that has absolutely nothing to do with Verona, and everything to do with why your own heart does what it does when something tells you a person is off limits. Think for a moment about anyone you've ever known who fell for someone too fast. The friend who, 3 weeks into a relationship, was already talking about moving in together, about forever, about a person they couldn't possibly know that well yet. Maybe you've been that friend yourself at some point, and only understood why much later, if you ever fully understood it at all. What was actually happening in Romeo and Juliet's garden that night is not some uniquely 16th century phenomenon belonging only to people in tights reciting verse. It is happening in some form to someone you know right now, and they probably can't see it any more clearly than Juliet could. Standing at that window, certain she was being careful even as she agreed to something most people would call reckless by morning. Chapter 1 continued, the kingdom of Olac. But there's another story, far from Verona, that needs to enter the room before we go any further, because it proves this isn't a quirk of one Italian playwright's imagination. It's a pattern human beings kept writing down independently, on opposite sides of the world, long before they had any way of knowing the other version existed. Travel south and east, past the Himalayas, down to a river delta in what is today northern Vietnam. There was once a kingdom called Olac, ruled by a king history remembers as An Jeong Vung. He had a problem most kings would have killed for, a weapon nobody could match. According to the legend, with the help of a sacred golden turtle spirit, he built a great citadel at a place called Kol Koloa, and was given a single claw from the turtle's own foot to use as the trigger of a crossbow. A crossbow that, the story says, could fire a volley powerful enough to cut down thousands of enemy soldiers in a single shot. The turtle's spirit was explicit about one condition. The secret of that weapon had to stay absolutely hidden, known to no one outside the king himself. And Jeong Vung kept that secret from his generals, from his ministers, from everyone, except eventually from his own daughter, because he loved her. And a man in love with his child rarely thinks of her as a security risk. Hold on to that detail. It's going to matter far more than it sounds like it should. Time after time, a northern warlord named Trieu Da sent his armies south to conquer Olac. Time after time, that crossbow sent them home in pieces. Eventually, Trieu Da ran out of patience for losing, and he tried something his soldiers couldn't manage on the battlefield. He proposed peace, and along with it, a marriage. His son, a young man named Thuy, would marry An Jeong Vung's daughter, a young woman named Chau. As part of the arrangement, Thuy would move into Kau Loa itself, living among his new wife's family as a son-in-law, inside the very walls protected by that unbeatable crossbow. An Jeong Vung agreed, maybe out of genuine hope for peace, maybe out of pride, certain that no amount of access could matter when he held the one weapon no army could survive. Notice something here, because it's the detail that separates this story from the one in Verona. Romeo climbed a wall in secret, at night, terrified of being caught. Thuy walked through the front gate with everyone's blessing, invited to stay. His danger wasn't getting caught. His danger was succeeding completely. What happened between Chau and Thuy over the following months wasn't a lightning strike across a crowded room. It was something slower and in its own way more unsettling. An enemy son living inside her own home, day after day, earning her trust one ordinary moment at a time, until trust stopped feeling like something she was choosing to give, and started feeling like simply how things were between them. The legend doesn't dwell on grand declarations. It dwells on the quiet accumulation of familiarity, shared meals, shared evenings. A husband who, as far as she could tell, loved her the way a husband is supposed to. There was no single moment she could have pointed to and said, "This is when I fell for him." That's precisely what made it so complete by the time it mattered. A love built in an instant can sometimes be questioned just as quickly. A love built slowly, day after day, over many months, starts to feel less like a feeling and more like a fact about the world. One night, sitting together under the stars, a moment that must have felt completely unremarkable to her at the time, Thuy asked the question he'd been waiting months to ask. What was it exactly that made Olak impossible to defeat? She told him. Not under torture, not under threat. She told her husband, the man she trusted completely. Because it never once occurred to her that the question itself might be the entire point of the marriage. She brought him the sacred crossbow. She showed him the golden claw fitted into its trigger mechanism and explained in detail exactly how it worked. Sit with that for a second. The way we sat with Juliet's contradiction back in Verona. This isn't a story about a girl swept away by a stranger's charm in a single reckless night. This is a story about something arguably more dangerous, trust that took months to grow, given to someone whose family her own father had been at war with for years, simply because love, once it settles in, has a way of quietly erasing the line between the man I married and the son of the man who wants to destroy my country. Trong secretly broke the crossbow's trigger, replaced it with a worthless copy, and told his wife it was time for him to visit his father up north, just for a while. And here the story gives us its second devastating detail. Before he left, Thuy asked Chau a question that sounds, on its surface, like nothing more than a husband's tender worry. If the two kingdoms ever went to war, and they were separated, how would he ever find her again? She had an answer ready. She told him she always wore a cloak lined with goose feathers, and that if she ever had to flee, she would tear off feather after feather and scatter them along the road behind her, a trail only someone looking for her would know to follow. Holthangt left for the north and never came back as the man she thought she'd married. What happened next moved fast. With the crossbow's secret in hand, Triotdar's army marched south again, and word reached An Seong Vung that the enemy was approaching the citadel walls. The king barely looked up from the game of chess in front of him. He'd heard this news before, more times than he could count, and every single time the crossbow had made the outcome a foregone conclusion. He laughed off the warning. He kept playing. Only when the enemy was already at the gate did he finally reach for the crossbow himself, and by then it was too late to discover, with his own hands, that the trigger in his grip was a worthless piece of carved wood. Certain the weapon that had saved his kingdom a dozen times would save it once more. An Seong Vung hadn't even hurried to defend the walls. By the time he understood the trigger had been swapped, the enemy was already at the gate. He grabbed Chau, mounted a horse and fled south toward the sea. And without meaning to, without understanding what she was doing or why, Chau did exactly what she had once promised her husband she would do. She tore feathers from her cloak and let them fall behind her, one by one, the entire way, marking a perfect trail for the army chasing them. She thought she was leaving a path home. She was leaving a map to her father's execution. At a mountain near the coast, with the sea in front of him and the enemy closing in from behind, An Seong Vung called out to the same golden turtle spirit who had once given him that crossbow claw. The turtle gave him one final piece of information. 4 words that turned his entire understanding of his daughter's marriage inside out in an instant. The enemy is sitting right behind you. He understood immediately, not metaphorically but literally. The trail of feathers, the questions in the night, the husband who left and never returned. All of it arranged itself into a single, unbearable shape. Picture the speed of that realization. A father who, only days earlier, still believed he was fleeing towards safety with his daughter beside him, suddenly understanding that the daughter beside him was, without ever intending to be, the reason there was nowhere left to flee to. There was no time in that moment for him to ask her why, or to hear her explain that she'd had no idea what those feathers meant when she promised them. In grief and fury that the legend doesn't try to soften or excuse, the king raised his sword against his own daughter, then walked into the sea and was never seen again. Thuy followed the feathers, the same trail he himself had set up to find her, all the way to the shore, and found her there instead of the reunion he may have told himself he still wanted. Whatever he felt in that moment, the story insists it was real grief, not performance. He carried her body home, buried her with his own hands, and, sometime later, unable to live with what his mission had cost, threw himself into a well at Koh Loa and drowned. The legend doesn't end there. People say that when Chau's blood reached the sea, the oysters along that coast began producing pearls, and that pearls washed in the water of that same well shine brighter than any others, as if the story itself refused to let the two of them be remembered only for betrayal and loss. For more than 2,000 years, the Vietnamese have argued about how to feel about this story, and that argument is itself the point worth borrowing for our purposes here. Some retellings treat Chau as a cautionary figure, proof of what happens when love is allowed to override every instinct for caution. Other versions are gentler toward her, treating her not as someone careless, but as someone who simply could not imagine that a love she'd lived inside for months could be the weapon used to destroy her. Both readings agree on one thing: nobody in this story falls for a stranger in a single dazzling night. They build something real, day by day, inside a structure designed from the very beginning to use that realness against them. Put Verona and Koh Loa side by side for a moment. In one, two teenagers fall instantly and recklessly for someone they barely know, because the danger surrounding that attraction makes it burn hotter than it would have otherwise. In the other, a young woman falls slowly and completely for someone she knows intimately, trusts fully, and still cannot see clearly, because the very closeness that made the love feel real is exactly what made the betrayal possible. One is a story about speed. The other is a story about blind spots that grow precisely where trust grows. You might be tempted to think these are simply two different tragedies that happen to rhyme. But notice what they share underneath the surface, once you strip away the swords and the crossbows and the centuries between them. In both stories, the people closest to the lovers could see the danger with perfect clarity from the outside. Tybalt saw a Montague in the room and reached for his sword instantly. And Jung Vung's own caution about the crossbow's secret should have applied to a son-in-law from an enemy house just as much as to any stranger. In both cases, the one piece of judgment that failed completely belonged to the person standing closest to the fire. That is not a coincidence. It's the first real clue that something measurable and repeatable is at work whenever love and danger are allowed to share the same room. Different mechanisms, different timelines, on opposite sides of the planet, separated by more than 1,000 years, and somehow arriving at the same devastating place. Chapter 1 continued again. A poet in the desert. There's a third story worth placing beside these two, because it comes from neither Europe nor East Asia, and it shows the same pattern, taking a shape neither Shakespeare nor storytellers of Koh Loa would recognize as their own, even as they'd recognize everything underneath it. Long before Shakespeare, in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, an old Bedouin legend tells of a young poet named Kays, who falls in love with a girl from his own tribe named Layla. Their families know each other. There is no ancient blood feud, no war between two kingdoms, no crossbow and no bronze statue waiting at the end. What stands between them is something quieter and, in its own way, just as immovable: tribal custom. Kays asks for Layla's hand and is refused not because he is unworthy in any way the tribe can name, but because it is considered improper for him to have declared his love for her so publicly, in verses recited in front of others, before any formal arrangement existed. Layla's father marries her instead to another man, from a family the tribe considers a more proper match. Kays does not recover from this the way custom expected him to. He wanders into the desert, refusing food, refusing shelter, reciting poetry to rocks and animals as though they might carry his words to her. The people around him begin calling him Majnun, literally possessed or madman, a name that has since traveled across Persian, Turkish, Urdu, and a dozen other languages as shorthand for a love so consuming it looks from the outside, indistinguishable from illness. He never marries. He never stops speaking her name. When Layla dies years later, still married to someone else, Majnun is found dead near her grave not long after, having spent the intervening years composing some of the most quoted romantic poetry in the history of the Islamic world. Notice what's different here, and notice what's exactly the same. Unlike Romeo and Juliet, Kays and Layla are never given even a handful of stolen hours together. Unlike Trong, Thuy and Chau, there is no marriage, no shared household, no slow accumulation of daily intimacy. What Majnun has instead is almost pure obstacle, a single refusal, absolute and permanent, that he then spends the rest of his life organizing every remaining year around. This is precisely why his story belongs here. If the Romeo and Juliet effect were only about the specific mechanics of secret gardens and enemy households, Majnun's story wouldn't fit it at all. But if what's actually driving all of this is something more general, the brain's tendency to treat obstruction itself as evidence of significance, to mistake an unfinished story for an unusually important one, then a poet in the Arabian desert 12 centuries ago, a princess inside a citadel in the Red River Delta, and two teenagers in an Italian courtyard should all show traces of the exact same underlying machinery. They do. In a few chapters, once you've met the psychologists who finally gave that machinery a name, you'll be able to see it in Majnun's poetry as clearly as you can see it in Romeo's balcony speech. A mind deprived of the ordinary, unremarkable access that turns infatuation into knowledge, filling that vacuum instead with the one resource obstruction never runs short of: longing. Now come back to Verona, because the tragedy there isn't finished. A wedding has happened in secret. Nobody outside a friar's stone cell knows about it yet. And the city itself is about to make sure that this marriage does not get the quiet, ordinary life two newlyweds might have hoped for. Chapter 1 concluded. What the feud actually cost. The marriage doesn't stay a secret for long, not because anyone discovers it directly, but because the city itself was never going to let two people from these two houses simply disappear into a quiet, happy life. Verona had other plans, and they involved a sword. Tybalt, the same cousin who'd wanted to draw his blade the moment he spotted Romeo across a crowded party, finally gets his chance. He runs into Romeo on the street in broad daylight, in front of witnesses from both households, and challenges him outright, expecting the rage he'd swallowed at the party to finally have somewhere to go. He calls him a villain. He demands satisfaction. What he doesn't know is that Romeo is now secretly family, married into the Capulet line by a few hours and a friar's blessing. Romeo refuses to fight him, trying genuinely to diffuse it, offering something close to friendship to a man who has spent his whole life hating his last name, baffling everyone watching. His best friend doesn't share that restraint. Mercutio, who has no idea about the secret wedding, and no patience left for watching his friend back down from an insult in the middle of a public street, draws his own sword instead. Swords meet in the kind of fast, ugly street violence that has nothing elegant about it. Romeo steps between them, trying to physically break it apart, and in the scramble, Tybalt's blade finds Mercutio underneath Romeo's own arm, almost as an accident of the chaos. Mercutio dies in the street minutes later, cursing both families with his last breath for dragging him into a feud that was never his to die for. Romeo, watching his closest friend bleed out in his arms, because of a hatred he himself was secretly trying to dissolve through marriage, does the one thing the morning's plan never accounted for. Grief turns instantly into something else entirely. He draws his sword, finds Tybalt, and kills him in the street in front of the same crowd that watched him refuse to fight only minutes earlier. Within a single afternoon, the boy who married into the Capulet family to end a feud has just killed a Capulet with his own hands. The Prince of Verona, who has had enough of this family's body count, banishes Romeo from the city for life, on pain of death if he's ever seen there again. This is the moment worth pausing on, because it's the hinge the entire rest of the story turns on, and it rarely gets the attention the balcony scene gets. Juliet now learns, within the same hour, that her new husband has killed her cousin, and that he's been exiled from the only city either of them has ever lived in. Grief and love are now occupying the exact same nerve at the exact same time, with no way to separate one from the other. She cannot mourn Tybalt the way her family expects her to, because mourning him means condemning the man she married days ago. She cannot celebrate her marriage openly, because the same act that created it just orphaned her of a cousin. There's no version of this where she gets to feel one clean emotion. That night before the banishment takes effect, Romeo and Juliet spend their only night together as husband and wife, knowing it might be the last night either of them ever sees the other. And here, watching from outside the marriage entirely, is where Lord and Lady Capulet make the decision that turns a tragedy already in motion into one with no possible exit. They see their daughter grieving, inconsolable, barely eating, and they read it exactly the way grief over a dead cousin should look. They have no idea they're actually watching a young bride who just said goodbye to her husband for what might be forever. So Lord Capulet, in what he genuinely believes is an act of fatherly kindness, decides the fastest cure for his daughter's sorrow is to give her something to look forward to. He moves the wedding to Paris up, not to next month, not to next week, but to 2 days from now. It's worth pointing out how reasonable this decision would look to absolutely anyone standing where Lord Capulet is standing. His daughter has just lost a cousin to violence. A respectable, devoted young man wants to marry her. Grief, in his experience, responds well to forward momentum. Nothing in his behavior here is malicious. The tragedy isn't that he's cruel, it's that he's making a perfectly sound decision based on information that happens to be catastrophically incomplete. A father trying to comfort his daughter accidentally schedules her into bigamy with a man she's never wanted, while she's still raw from saying goodbye to the husband he doesn't know she has. Juliet refuses. She tells her parents, as firmly as a 14-year-old in this household is allowed to tell her parents anything, that she will not marry Paris. Her father's response is not negotiation. It's an ultimatum. Marry Paris on Thursday, or be disowned completely, thrown out with nothing. She has no one left to turn to who knows the truth, except the nurse and the friar, and even the nurse, the one adult who has been on her side since infancy, starts to crack under the pressure, quietly suggesting that maybe marrying Paris and simply moving forward wouldn't be the worst outcome. From the nurse's perspective, this advice is genuinely loving, a practical way out of an impossible situation for a girl she's terrified of losing entirely. But notice what's actually happening to Juliet in this moment, because it's the second half of the mechanism this entire video exists to explain. Every single person who's supposed to be protecting her is now, each for their own well-meaning reason, pushing her further away from anyone who might tell her the truth, and further into isolation with a secret she can share with almost no one. The walls aren't just closing in around her relationship anymore. They're closing in around her entirely. If you've ever watched someone you love slowly stop mentioning a relationship around the family table, stop bringing it up, stop correcting people who ask if they're seeing anyone, start answering questions about their life, with careful edited half-truths, you've watched a smaller, quieter version of exactly what's happening to Juliet right now. Isolation rarely arrives as a single dramatic event. It arrives as a series of people who love someone, each one closing off one more avenue of honesty for reasons that feel completely reasonable from where they're standing. By the time anyone realizes how alone that person has become, it can look from the outside like it happened overnight. It almost never did. It's worth zooming out here. Because the wedge driving Romeo and Juliet apart by this point in the story isn't really about Capulet versus Montague anymore. It's something older than that feud. Nobody in either household ever stopped to ask why the hatred started in the first place. By this point, almost no one, not Lord Capulet, not the prince, not even Tybalt, who died for it, could actually tell you the original cause of the feud between House Montague and House Capulet. It's a hatred with no living memory of its own justification, inherited the way a family recipe is inherited, followed out of habit long after anyone remembers why it started. Two people are about to die for a war whose original combatants are already gone, whose original grievance nobody can name. Chapter 2. The study that named it far more often than a villain. An obstacle to love turns out to be a tired father who genuinely believes a quick wedding will fix his daughter's grief. A loving grandmother who genuinely believes a different partner would make her grandson happier. A worried mother who genuinely believes that withholding all daughter's identification papers is the only language left that her daughter will listen to. An obstacle feels unbeatable precisely because it isn't coming from malice that could simply be argued away. It's coming from love, aimed in a direction the person on the receiving end experiences as a wall. That detail, that the obstacle was built by good intentions, not villains, is exactly why what happens next deserves more credit than 4 centuries of retellings have given it. Because in 1972, 2 researchers sitting in an office in the United States were about to ask a very simple, very uncomfortable question about exactly this pattern. What if it isn't the love story that's special? What if it's something measurable? Something happening inside the brain of anyone facing this exact configuration of obstacles, regardless of where they live, what century it is, or whether anyone involved even thinks of themselves as star-crossed at all. They weren't interested in Verona, or in Koloa, or in the desert where Majnun wandered, or in any story passed down through literature and legend. They wanted real couples, alive in their own decade, willing to fill out questionnaires about their own relationships, their own parents, their own fights at the dinner table over who they were allowed to bring home. In 1972, a psychologist named Richard Driscoll, working with a colleague named Keith Davis and a graduate student named Milton Lippetz, decided to do something almost embarrassingly simple, the kind of study that sounds obvious only after someone has already done it. They wanted to know whether parents interfering in their children's relationships actually pushed couples apart, the way every instinct in a worried parent assumes it must. So they found 140 real couples, some married, some not, all at different points in their relationships, recruited the unglamorous way, through community contacts and word of mouth, not actors playing a part. And they asked them, carefully and repeatedly, over a period stretching from 6 months to nearly a year, 2 kinds of questions. How much interference are your parents giving you about this relationship, right now? And, separately, using established psychological measures, designed specifically for this purpose. How much do you trust this person? Feel committed to them? Feel physically and emotionally drawn to them? Feel like your life is tangled up in theirs? Then they did the part that actually matters, the part that separates a real finding from a coincidence. They didn't just look at a single snapshot in time, which would have told them almost nothing useful. Plenty of intensely loved couples might simply also happen to have difficult parents, with no causal story connecting the two. Instead, they went back to the same 140 couples months later and asked the exact same questions again, tracking each individual relationship as it moved through time. They wanted to see the change itself, whether an increase in parental interference in any given couple over those months was followed by a decrease in love, the way you'd expect if interference simply wore relationships down through stress and conflict, or whether something else, something almost nobody had bothered to seriously test before, was happening instead. What they found ran in the opposite direction from almost every assumption a worried parent operates on. When parental interference went up over that stretch of months, a couple's reported love for each other tended to go up as well, not down, up. The two researchers had almost by accident captured something that had been hiding in plain sight inside one of the most famous plays in the English language for nearly 400 years. And they named the pattern exactly what you'd expect two people steeped in that play would name it: the Romeo and Juliet Effect. It's worth being precise about the size of this finding, because precision is exactly what gets lost every time a study like this turns into a 5-second internet caption. Driscoll and his colleagues weren't claiming that every single one of the 140 couples experienced this pattern, or that interference is some kind of guaranteed love potion. They were describing a statistical tendency, visible across the group as a whole, strong enough to be unlikely to be chance, but not so absolute that it applied to every relationship in the sample without exception. Some couples under heavy pressure from their families drifted apart exactly the way you'd expect. Most, on average, didn't, and a meaningful number actually grew closer. Science rarely hands you a rule with 0 exceptions. It hands you a pattern strong enough to take seriously, and that's exactly what this was. Sit with how strange that finding actually is, stripped of the literary reference that makes it sound charming. A father telling his daughter she may not see a man again is not on its face an act that should make her love him more. By any straightforward logic, it's a stressor, a source of conflict, a reason for the relationship to feel harder and less appealing to maintain. And yet, across 140 real relationships tracked over real months, the data kept pointing the same direction. Pressure from the outside didn't reliably erode the bond. In many of these couples, it appeared to be feeding it. Driscoll and Davis weren't claiming that opposition causes love from nothing, that two strangers with no spark would suddenly fall for each other, purely because someone disapproved. That's not what the data showed. What they found is closer to an amplifier than an engine. If something is already there, some real attraction, some real connection, interference doesn't extinguish it the way you'd expect. In a meaningful number of cases, it appears to turn the volume up. It's also worth asking honestly why a worried parent's first instinct so consistently gets this backwards. Most people assume disapproval works like friction on a moving object, something that should slow a relationship down the more of it you apply. What the data suggests instead is closer to how oxygen works on a fire. It doesn't create the fire, but once there's already something burning, oxygen doesn't put it out, it feeds it. A parent who forbids, lectures, threatens, or simply makes their disapproval unmistakably isn't applying brakes. They're often, without meaning to, applying fuel to a flame that was already lit, and then standing back confused when the fire only grows. But why would a brain do that? Why would human psychology be built in a way that treats obstacles as fuel instead of as warning signs? For an answer to that question, you have to leave the world of survey data entirely and go stand on a bridge in Canada that has nothing to do with romance at all, at least not on paper. Chapter 3. The Bridge in the early 1970s. Two psychologists, Donald Dutton and Arthur Aaron, picked one of the most unsettling structures they could find for an experiment: the Capilano Suspension Bridge, a narrow footbridge strung high over a canyon in North Vancouver, the kind that sways and bounces visibly under your feet with every step, with low handrails. wooden planks you can see straight through to the river far below, and a wind that never quite stops moving it. Men crossing that bridge alone on foot, in the middle of an ordinary day, were approached partway across by a young woman, actually a research assistant working for the study, who asked them to fill out a short questionnaire, part of what she described as a project on scenic surroundings. Nothing about her introduction mentioned attraction, dating, or psychology at all. After they finished the questionnaire, almost as an afterthought, she gave them her phone number and told them she'd be happy to explain more about the research if they had further questions. The exact same setup happened again, with a different group of men entirely, on a separate, ordinary bridge nearby, solid, built low to the ground, with sturdy railings, barely moving at all. Nothing remotely frightening about the crossing. Here's the question the experiment was actually testing. Underneath the cover story about scenery, would men who just crossed a terrifying swaying bridge, hearts pounding, palms sweating, adrenaline running through their bodies for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with the woman in front of them, be more likely to call her afterward than men who'd crossed the calm bridge and felt nothing unusual in their bodies at all? They were, and not by a small margin. Significantly more of the men from the frightening bridge called the number afterward than men from the solid one, and their questionnaires, filled out on the spot while their hearts were presumably still settling, also rated her as noticeably more attractive than the men on the calm bridge did. Now, here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you, because it's the actual mechanism, not just an interesting coincidence about bridges. None of those men consciously thought, "I am afraid right now, therefore I find this woman attractive." Their brains didn't hand them an explanation that honest. What happened instead is something psychologists call misattribution of arousal. The body, in that moment, is flooded with all the physical signatures of intense emotion, racing heart, quickened breath, a kind of heightened electric alertness. The brain, doing its best to make sense of all that internal noise in real time, reaches for the most obvious explanation available in the environment around it. On a swaying bridge with nothing else going on, the obvious explanation sitting right in front of you is the attractive stranger asking you questions. The fear doesn't disappear. It gets relabeled quietly and instantly as attraction. This is not some obscure laboratory curiosity that only matters on Canadian footbridges. It's the entire unspoken logic behind why horror movies have quietly been one of the most reliable first-date choices for generations. Why amusement park rides and haunted houses show up so often in early dating. Why a roller coaster, a thunderstorm, or a near miss on the highway can leave two people suddenly feeling closer than a calm dinner ever managed to. Nobody plans a first date around a horror movie because they've read the Capilano Bridge study. They do it because somewhere in the accumulated folk wisdom of dating, people noticed this effect long before anyone gave it a name. Fear works on the body the same way attraction does, and the body, left to sort that out on its own, often gets it wrong in exactly the direction you'd want it to. If your actual goal is to feel a spark, hold that mechanism in your hands for a second, and then walk back 400 years to a garden in Verona. Romeo climbing a wall into enemy territory at night, body humming with the very real fear of being discovered and killed by a household that hates his name, looks up and sees a girl at a window. Juliet, having just been told her future is a transaction she has no say in, suddenly finds herself talking in secret, in the dark, to someone whose mere presence in her garden puts them both in danger. Both of their nervous systems are already flooded, not with the chemistry of love specifically, but with the raw, undifferentiated arousals of fear, secrecy, and risk. And both of their brains do exactly what those men's brains did on that bridge. They take the racing heart, the quickened breath, the heightened alertness, and they attach the most available label sitting in front of them. Not I am in danger, but I am in love. Notice too how perfectly the architecture of their courtship is built to keep manufacturing that exact chemistry. Conversation after conversation. They cannot meet in daylight in public, the way an ordinary couple might. Slowly over many ordinary afternoons, with nothing at stake but whether they enjoy each other's company. Every single meeting has to happen at night, in secret, with a household full of people who would kill one of them on sight just beyond a wall or a door. There is no version of getting to know each other that isn't simultaneously an exercise in surviving detection. Which means every single data point either of them ever collects about how they feel in each other's presence arrives pre-mixed with fear, the two sensations so thoroughly blended by circumstance that neither Romeo nor Juliet ever gets the chance to find out what it might feel like to simply be bored together, safely, on an unremarkable Tuesday. Walk back further still, to a garden in Chau, where a young woman is falling for a man whose presence inside her own walls should be setting off every alarm her father ever trained into her. Notice the same chemistry running quietly underneath a much slower courtship, a low, sustained hum of risk that never gets named, never gets questioned, because it arrives wrapped in months of ordinary domestic life, instead of a single dramatic night. Her arousal isn't the spike and crash of a swaying bridge. It's something closer to a low current running underneath an entire marriage. The quiet, unexamined tension of loving a man whose very existence in her home is itself the unresolved question of an unfinished war. She never gets a calm, ordinary baseline to compare it against either. There was never a version of her relationship with Trong or Thuy that existed outside the shadow of who his father was. And walk one more step, to the desert where Majnun composed his poetry to an audience of rocks and sand. His arousal has no bridge, no garden, no household to hide from at all, only the ceaseless, unresolved presence of a woman he cannot have, replaying in his mind without corrective friction of her actual, ordinary, imperfect daily company. In some ways his case is the purest of the three, because there is no real relationship left for his nervous system to calibrate against. There is only the obstacle itself, endlessly rehearsed, and a brain doing to a memory what those men's brains did to a stranger on a bridge. Taking a body flooded with unresolved feeling and filing all of it under longing. This is the actual machinery behind the Romeo and Juliet effect. The gears turning underneath Driscoll and Davis's survey data. Parental interference, social disapproval, the threat of getting caught, the danger of a rival house or a rival kingdom. None of it is romantic on its own terms. All of it is, however, deeply and reliably arousing in the strict physiological sense of that word. Arousal, once it's running through your body with nowhere else obvious to go, has an old, well-documented habit of getting filed under whatever emotion happens to be standing closest to it when your brain goes looking for an explanation. This doesn't mean Romeo and Juliet's feelings weren't real to them. It means something more uncomfortable than that. The intensity of those feelings cannot be trusted, on its own, as proof of how deep or how lasting they actually were. Intensity and depth are not the same measurement, even though they feel from the inside exactly identical. A feeling can be completely real, completely overwhelming, and still be substantially manufactured by circumstances that have nothing to do with the actual compatibility of the two people standing inside it. Think about how this plays out away from gardens and bridges entirely. Two co-workers thrown together under the pressure of a deadline that might cost them both their jobs, working late into the night side by side, often come out the other end of that crisis, convinced they've discovered a once-in-a-lifetime connection, when what they may have actually discovered is two nervous systems running hot from stress with each other, as the only available explanation in the room. A breakup followed almost immediately by a new, intoxicating relationship often gets described by the person living through it as the realest thing they've ever felt, when at least part of what they're feeling is the leftover adrenaline of grief, relabeled by a brain that needed somewhere to put it. Now, hold on to the bridge. Hold on to the wall Romeo climbed in the dark, because both of them are about to become the same exact data point, sitting right next to a young couple you haven't met yet, in a country none of this research was ever originally about. Chapter 4. DM and Kai is 26 years old, works at a bank branch in Thuy, in the Mekong Delta, and for most of her life, she has done almost everything her family expected of her. Good grades, a stable job, the kind of daughter relatives bring up approvingly at family gatherings, as an example for younger cousins to follow. She grew up in a house where the rules were never written down anywhere, but everyone understood them anyway. Marry someone with a stable career, ideally someone whose family the relatives already know. Ideally someone from the city or somewhere close to it. DM had never had reason to question any of this. There had simply never been anyone serious enough to test it. None of that prepared her for what happens the day a construction engineer named Kai walks into her branch to open an account for a project he's just been assigned to in the city. He's 28, originally from a small province several hours away, working in Thuy on a contract that's supposed to last about a year. He's polite, a little awkward with paperwork, makes a joke that lands badly enough that DM has to suppress a laugh in front of a customer she's supposed to be professionally assisting. There's nothing about the moment that announces itself as significant. He is just another customer, slightly out of his depth in front of a stack of forms, and she's just doing her job. It's not lightning. It's not a single charged glance across a crowded room. It's closer to what actually happens to most adults who fall for someone. A handful of small, unremarkable interactions repeated over several weeks that slowly stop feeling unremarkable. He comes back to the branch more than strictly necessary for someone managing a single business account. She starts noticing what time he usually shows up. Eventually he asks if she'd like to get coffee sometime, somewhere outside the bank, and she says yes before she's fully decided whether this is a good idea. For the first few months, there is nothing here that resembles Verona or Chau Loa at all. No feuding houses, no secret crossbow, just two adults getting to know each other slowly, the way people are supposed to. Dinners after work, weekend trips to nearby towns, the gradual, ordinary accumulation of inside jokes and shared habits that makes a relationship start to feel like a real structure instead of just a feeling. Kai learns which dishes she actually likes versus which ones she orders just to be polite to whoever she's eating with. DM learns that he calls his mother every Sunday evening without fail, a small, unglamorous detail that tells her more about his character than any grand gesture could have. Then DM brings Kai home to meet her parents. Her mother is polite in the strange, not quite formal way people are polite when they've already decided something and are simply being too well-mannered to say it out loud yet. She offers him tea, asks about his family, his hometown, all the standard questions. But there's a flatness to her voice that DM has learned to recognize over 26 years of living in that house. The particular tone her mother uses when she's performing hospitality rather than feeling it. Her father barely speaks to him at dinner, asks 2 questions about his job and his salary, phrased carefully as a question about the construction industry these days, and excuses himself early. Afterward, once Kai has left, walking the long way to the bus stop because DM's father didn't offer to have a driver take him, her mother says the thing that's been sitting underneath the politeness all evening. He's not from here. His family doesn't have money. He has no stable property in the city, no long-term prospects anyone in the family can point to with confidence. He is, in the blunt language DM's mother actually uses, not someone she should be building a future with. This is worth pausing on, because the specific shape of this objection matters. DM's parents aren't worried about Kai as a person. They don't claim he's unkind, or dishonest, or disrespectful. Their objection is almost entirely about category. Where he's from, what his family has, what kind of future a marriage to him would or wouldn't guarantee. It's an old, deeply familiar calculation in many Vietnamese families, one that's been running quietly underneath marriage decisions for generations, organized around a phrase you'll hear in from an older relative in nearly every region of the country: Mon Dung Hort Doi, the principle of matched households. The belief that families of comparable standing should marry into each other. Doors and households that match. Families of comparable standing joining together as equals. And Kai's family, in her parents' eyes, simply doesn't match the door DM was raised behind. This calculation isn't unique to DM's household, and it isn't some relic that's quietly disappearing as the country modernizes. Vietnam's General Statistics Office has tracked a broader, related shift over recent decades. The average age, at first marriage climbing steadily, from the mid-20s toward the late 20s for men, and from the early 20s toward the mid-20s for women, between 1989 and 2023, alongside a rising share of adults who remain unmarried well into their 30s. Researchers studying this trend point to several overlapping causes: more years spent in education, more women building careers before marriage, a rising cost of urban housing. But one thread that keeps surfacing in interviews and surveys is exactly the friction DM is living through right now. Young adults increasingly choosing partners based on compatibility and feeling, while an older generation still measures a match by family standing, hometown, and property. The gap between those two ways of evaluating a relationship doesn't always end a marriage before it starts, but it adds a kind of friction to modern Vietnamese courtship that earlier generations, marrying within tighter, more homogeneous social circles, rarely had to negotiate at this scale. DM pushes back gently at first, then less gently, as the conversation continues over the following weeks. She points out that Kai is hard-working, that his engineering contract pays reasonably well, that character should count for more than where someone's family happens to be from. Her mother's response doesn't change. It just gets repeated in different words, with increasing frequency, until it becomes the backdrop of nearly every conversation DM and her mother have. Notice what's happening here, because it's a quieter, more drawn-out version of exactly what happened to Juliet, just stretched across weeks instead of compressed into a single household ultimatum. The opposition isn't loud or dramatic at first. It's persistent. It shows up at every family dinner, every holiday, every casual mention of weekend plans. And persistence, it turns out, according to the very same research we just spent an entire chapter unpacking, doesn't need to be dramatic to do its work. It just needs to be constant. This is also the point in the story where it's worth bringing in a second piece of psychological theory, one that doesn't explain why obstacles intensify feeling, but explains something just as important. What was actually missing from Romeo and Juliet's relationship in the first place, and what DM and Kai, unlike their Renaissance predecessors, had the rare chance to actually build before the obstacles showed up. Chapter 5. The Triangle. In 1986, a psychologist named Robert Sternberg proposed a way of thinking about love that has held up remarkably well across decades of further research, partly because it's simple enough to actually use and precise enough to explain why some relationships that feel intensely alive turn out to be fragile, while others that feel calmer turn out to last. Sternberg wasn't trying to write poetry about love. He was trying to do something far more clinical: break an experience most people treat as a single, indivisible feeling into separate, identifiable components that could actually be examined, compared, and tracked over time. The same way a doctor might break feeling unwell down into specific, measurable symptoms instead of treating it as one vague cloud. He argued that love, in its complete form, is built from three separate components, each developing on a different timeline, each capable of existing without the other two. The first is passion, the physical and emotional towards someone, the spark, the desire, the thing that gets activated fastest and burns hottest early in a relationship, often within days or even hours of meeting someone. The second is intimacy, the closeness, the warmth, the sense of really knowing someone and being known by them in return, built slowly, through actual time spent together, through vulnerability that's been tested and held safely more than once. The third is commitment, the conscious decision to stay, to build a future together, to keep choosing the relationship, even on the days when passion has cooled and intimacy is being tested by ordinary life. Sternberg went further still, mapping out what each possible combination of these three ingredients actually produces. Passion alone, without the other two, he called infatuation, the kind of intense, all-consuming crush that can feel enormous and collapse just as quickly. Intimacy alone, without passion or commitment, he called liking, the comfortable warmth of real friendship. When all three are present together, fully developed, you get what he called consummate love. The kind most people are actually hoping to find when they say they want a great relationship. A kind that tends to last, because it isn't relying on any single one of the three to carry the entire weight alone. Now look back at Romeo and Juliet's relationship through this exact framework, and the play reveals something that's almost invisible if you only ever read it as a tragedy of fate. They have passion in overwhelming abundance, arguably more concentrated passion packed into fewer hours than almost any other couple in literature. What they categorically do not have, because the entire structure of their circumstances makes it impossible, is intimacy built over real time, or commitment tested against the slow accumulation of ordinary days. Their entire relationship, from the party to the tomb, takes place across roughly 4 days. 4 days is enough time to feel something enormous. It is not enough time to actually know someone in the deep, tested, weathered sense that the word intimacy is supposed to mean, and it is certainly not enough time to know whether a commitment made in the heat of that passion would survive contact with an ordinary Tuesday 5 years later. By Sternberg's own framework, what Romeo and Juliet experienced has a name, and it isn't consummate love. It's much closer to what he simply called infatuated love, passion running at full intensity, with intimacy and commitment still only theoretical, promised in words, but never actually tested against time. This is precisely what DM and Kai had before her parents ever found out. Months of slow, ordinary intimacy, built in daylight, in public, with no clock running out, no household waiting to kill one of them on sight. They'd had time to see each other tired, see each other annoyed over something trivial, see each other on days when nothing romantic was happening at all, just two people getting dinner after a long shift and comparing complaints about difficult co-workers. They had already started building the second leg of Sternberg's triangle before the obstacle ever arrived to test it, in a way that Romeo never got the chance to do with Juliet, and that Chau, ironically, did get the chance to do with Trong Thuy, except her intimacy was built on a foundation that turned out to be a deception from the very beginning, which is its own warning we'll return to later, which raises the genuinely important question this video is now positioned to start answering directly. When real obstacles do show up, when a family does start applying pressure, the way DM's family is applying it right now, the same patient, repeated disapproval the research in the last chapter described, Does that pressure operate any differently on a relationship that already has intimacy underneath it, compared to one like Romeo and Juliet's that never had the chance to build any? Does an existing foundation make a couple more resistant to the kind of misattributed, danger-fueled intensity that swept two teenagers into a wedding within a single night? Or does it simply mean the fire has more fuel to burn through before anyone can tell the difference between real love and manufactured urgency? That question is going to take the rest of this video to answer fully. But DM's story is where we're going to watch it actually play out in real time, in a relationship that has something Verona never gave its two most famous teenagers: enough of a foundation to find out what survives once the passion stops doing all the work on its own. Because the pressure on DM and Kai is only just beginning. What her mother has said at the dinner table so far is, as you're about to find out, the gentlest version of what this family is capable of when it decides a relationship needs to end. For a while, the pressure stays at the level of dinner table comments and pointed silences. The kind of conflict that's exhausting but survivable, the kind a couple can absorb without it touching the actual structure of the relationship. DM starts timing her visits home around her mother's mood. She stops mentioning Kai's name unless directly asked. The same quiet editing we talked about back in Verona. The small daily erosions that nobody notices happening until the silence has become its own kind of conversation. Then DM makes a decision that turns this from background and tension into an open conflict. She tells her parents that she and Kai are talking about getting married once his contract in the city becomes more permanent, which his company has already hinted might happen within the year. Her mother's reaction is immediate, and it's not a conversation this time. It's an ultimatum, delivered the way ultimatums tend to be delivered in households where one generation still holds most of the practical power over the other. If DM continues this relationship, her mother will not attend the wedding, will not acknowledge it as a real marriage to the rest of the family, will tell every relative who asks that her daughter has disgraced the family by marrying beneath herself. The threat isn't abstract. In a family, in a community where extended relatives still gather for holidays, and where a daughter's marriage is treated as a reflection on the entire household, being publicly disowned in this way carries a weight that's difficult to translate for anyone who's grown up in a more individualistic family structure. It isn't just about losing her mother's approval. It's about losing her place inside an entire social fabric she's been woven into since birth. DM's father, quieter than her mother throughout this entire conflict, eventually adds his own version of the same pressure, framed less as anger and more as a kind of cold disappointment that somehow lands harder than shouting would have. It's worth pausing here to note something about how this pressure differs from Juliet's father's. Even though the underlying instinct is identical, parents who believe, with total sincerity, that they know better than their adult children what kind of life will make them happy haven't disappeared just because the law now formally recognizes an adult daughter's right to choose her own spouse. What's changed is the shape the conflict takes. Juliet's father could simply command, backed by the full social and legal authority of a 16th century household, where a daughter had essentially no independent standing at all. DM's mother, operating in a society that has formally granted her daughter that standing, has to find other levers, emotional, financial, practical, to exert the same underlying control. The instinct survived 400 years of social change completely intact. Only its tools had to evolve to fit a world that no longer hands parents that authority automatically. Eventually, DM's mother goes further than words. She confiscates DM's identification card, keeping it locked away, calculating correctly that without it, DM cannot easily register a marriage, open certain accounts, or complete the paperwork a wedding would require. It's a small, bureaucratic, almost bloodless act, nothing like a sword or a crossbow, and it accomplishes something that would have taken Lord Capulet, a raised voice, and a threat of disownment to achieve 4 centuries earlier. Kai, for his part, finds out about the confiscated identification card a few days later, and his reaction is its own quiet test of everything this video has been building toward. He doesn't show up at DM's parents' apartment demanding it back. He doesn't pressure her to choose immediately between him and her family, the way a less patient or more insecure partner might. He listens mostly and offers to slow things down, to stop talking about marriage publicly for now, to give her room to navigate her family without forcing a confrontation on his timeline rather than hers. It's a small detail, easy to miss in a story this charged, but it's exactly the kind of small detail Sternberg's framework would predict matters enormously. A partner whose first instinct under pressure is to protect the relationship's foundation, rather than escalate the danger surrounding it. Here's where this story is genuinely going to test everything. Chapter 2 just taught you, because this is exactly the configuration Driscoll and Davis's research describes. Escalating, undeniable, deeply personal parental interference, exactly the configuration that, according to their data, should be making DM's feelings for Kai burn hotter, not weaker. And by her own account, in the weeks following the confiscation of her papers, it does. She describes feeling during this period more certain about Kai than she had at any point earlier in the relationship. A fierce, almost defiant clarity that this is the man she's choosing, regardless of what it costs her with her own family. Every instinct in her body, in exactly the way the bridge experiment predicted, is reading the danger of this conflict and relabeling it as proof of how much she loves him. Friends who see her during this period describe her as somehow both more exhausted and more resolved than they've ever seen her. Exactly the paradoxical combination Driscoll and Davis's data would predict, intensity rising in lockstep with the obstacle itself. But here is the detail that the rest of this video has been quietly building toward, the detail that separates DM's situation from Juliet's in a way that matters enormously for what happens next. DM doesn't only have intensity right now. She also has 8 months of ordinary, already lived intimacy with Kai sitting underneath that intensity. Actual knowledge of how he behaves under stress, how he treats people who can't do anything for him, how he handles disappointment, whether his patience holds up on a bad day. Juliet, standing at her window 400 years earlier, had none of that to draw on. She had 4 days and a stranger's promises. DM has 8 months in a relationship that's already been tested by ordinary life, before it was ever tested by her family. This single difference is the entire reason this video exists in the form it does. Not to tell you that forbidden love is good or bad, but to show you, side by side, what happens when the exact same psychological fuel gets poured onto 2 completely different foundations. Romeo had 4 days of pure passion, and nothing underneath it to anchor that passion when reality finally arrived. DM has the same surging, danger-fueled intensity Driscoll and Davis measured in their couples, but she also has 8 months of evidence. 8 months of watching Kai be patient, be kind, be steady in small, unglamorous moments nobody was watching, that she can actually weigh against that intensity, instead of mistaking the intensity for the entire relationship. This is exactly the moment her decision gets made. The decision the entire story has been quietly building toward, the one we're not going to reveal in full until later. What we can tell you now is this. Faced with her mother's ultimatum, DM does not run. She does not elope in secret the way Romeo and Juliet did, marrying within hours and hoping the families would simply have to accept it after the fact. And she also does not simply give in, the way her mother is clearly hoping she eventually will, once the pressure runs long enough. She makes a third choice instead, one that takes considerably longer, costs her something different than either of the obvious paths would have, and depends entirely on whether 8 months of real intimacy with Kai turns out to be strong enough to survive a conflict this serious, without either of them doing something they can't take back. Hold that uncertainty for now, the same way Shakespeare made his hold their breath through an entire act before the wedding night, the same way the legend of Chau made its listeners wait generation after generation to find out exactly what those goose feathers would cost. Because what DM chooses to do next, and what it actually costs her, and what it actually saves, depends on a piece of psychological science we haven't introduced yet. The question of where exactly a person's capacity to trust someone like Kai in the first place actually comes from, and why two people raised in completely different households can walk into the exact same family ultimatum and respond to it in completely opposite ways. Some people, faced with exactly this kind of pressure, become more anxious about the relationship itself, gripping tighter, needing constant reassurance that their partner won't also abandon them the way it feels like their family is threatening to. Others go in the opposite direction, pulling back emotionally the moment things get difficult, protecting themselves by refusing to depend on anyone too completely, even the person they claim to love most. And a smaller group manages something that looks, from the outside, almost effortless. Staying steady, communicating clearly, neither clinging nor withdrawing even while everything around them is falling apart. These aren't random personality differences scattered across the population by chance. They're patterns with a name, a history, and a surprisingly precise scientific origin story that starts, of all places, in a room with a one-way mirror, watching 1-year-olds react to a stranger. That question takes us somewhere neither Verona nor Chau, and not even DM's apartment in Cantor, but instead all the way back to the earliest years of childhood, to a woman in a laboratory in the 1970s, watching toddlers react to their mothers, leaving a room and discovering something that would eventually explain why some people, faced with exactly the kind of pressure DM is facing right now, run straight into the fire, while others, given the same pressure, somehow manage to walk through it without burning down everything around them. We're going to meet a second couple first, though. Before we get there, a couple whose story makes DM's family conflict look almost gentle by comparison, and whose situation will make the stakes of where trust actually comes from impossible to ignore. Chapter 6. How and fuck their names are Wa and Fuck. What their two families discover about each other's bloodlines is going to make Mondang Hordoi, the principle that families of comparable standing should marry into each other, look like the easiest objection in the world to overcome. Hoa is 24 years old, works as a kindergarten teacher in a small town outside Cantor, and the man she's fallen in love with is named Fuck, 27, a motorbike mechanic who runs a small repair shop 2 streets over from the school where she works. They met the way a lot of small-town couples meet, through a mutual friend at a wedding, dancing badly to a song neither of them particularly liked, laughing about it afterward in a way that turned into a habit of finding excuses to see each other again. He started bringing her lunch on days he knew her school let out early. She started bringing her bike to his shop for repairs it didn't strictly need, just to have an excuse to sit on the plastic stool outside his garage and talk to him while he worked. For the first several months, nothing about their relationship resembles a tragedy in the making. If anything, by the standards of what we've already seen in this video, theirs looks like the easiest pairing imaginable. Similar background, similar income, families who, on the surface, seem to know each other at least a little. The way people in a small town tend to know each other, recognizing faces at the market, nodding at the same funerals and weddings, existing within the same general social orbit without being especially close. There is no version of the matched households problem here. Nobody's family has more money than the others. Nobody's job carries more prestige. By every metric that caused DM's mother to lock away her daughter's identification card, Wow and Fuck should be, if anything, an unusually uncomplicated match. The kind of relationship a worried parent in this video would normally have nothing whatsoever to object to. Which is exactly what makes what happens next so disorienting for both of them. It starts almost accidentally at a family gathering, a memorial ceremony for a relative on Hua's side, the kind of event that pulls in second and third cousins from across the region, people who only see each other once or twice a year. At exactly these occasions, sitting on low plastic stools under a tarp strung up against the afternoon sun, incense smoke drifting over trays of food set out for the ancestors before anyone is allowed to eat. Phuc comes along at Hwa's invitation to meet more of her extended family before things get more serious between them, more nervous about it than Hwa expected, dressing carefully, asking her twice in the days before what he should bring as a gift for the household. Over the course of that afternoon of introductions and small talk, an elderly relative on Hwa's side, a great aunt, sharp-eyed and unusually attentive to the kind of genealogical detail younger generations rarely bother tracking anymore, starts asking Phuc questions about his family, the way older relatives at these gatherings often do, treating a new face as an opportunity to place him somewhere on the map of everyone she's ever known, where his grandparents were from, what his grandfather's name was, which branch of which family his mother married into. Phuc answers easily at first, glad for the attention, glad to be making a good impression. The questions seem harmless, a kind of polite interrogation older relatives often perform on a young person being introduced into the family circle. But the great aunt's expression changes partway through, in a way that several people in the room notice before anyone says anything out loud. A stillness coming over her face, her eyes narrowing slightly as she repeats one of his answers back to him, slower, as if checking she'd heard it correctly. She excuses herself. She makes a phone call to another relative, someone even older, someone who spent decades being the unofficial keeper of the family's history, the kind of person every extended family seems to have, who can kite who married, whom 3 generations back without consulting a single written record. By the end of the day, what started as polite small talk has turned into something that will reshape the rest of Hwa and Phuc's relationship. According to the family's own genealogical records, going back roughly 4 generations, Phuc's family and Hwa's family share a common ancestor. They are, by the reckoning that matters most to the older generation in this family, distant cousins. This is the moment worth sitting with carefully, because it's a genuinely different category of obstacle than anything we've examined so far in this video, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms, rather than treated as simply a stranger or more exotic version of DM and Kai's problem. Verona had 2 families who hated each other. Ko Loa had 2 kingdoms at war. DM's family had a class and status objection. Hwa and Phuc's families are facing something that isn't really about hatred or status or politics at all. It's about blood, or more precisely about a deeply held belief, still carried by older generations in many parts of Vietnam and across much of East Asia, that marriage between even distantly related kin, particularly within a certain number of generations, is something close to taboo, regardless of how many generations actually separate the common ancestor from the 2 people standing in front of you now. The exact number of generations considered acceptable varies by family, by region, by how strictly a particular lineage tracks its own genealogy. Some families consider 4 generations distant enough that the connection barely registers as meaningful, treating it as little more than historical trivia, a kind of thing you might mention once at a gathering and then never bring up again. Others, particularly families with strong patrilineal traditions that have maintained detailed ancestral records, written genealogies, and family altars and ceremonies that explicitly trace descent back many generations specifically to preserve exactly this kind of knowledge, treat any traceable shared ancestor as disqualifying, no matter how many generations have passed since, no matter how diluted the actual biological connection has become with each passing generation. Thuy's great-aunt belongs unmistakably to the second category, and increasingly, so do other senior relatives on both sides, once the news spreads through phone calls and visits over the following days. This isn't a preference or a worry, it's closer to a rule, inherited and treated as close to non-negotiable as anything in the family's entire belief system. The kind of conviction that doesn't bend simply because two young people happen to be unhappy about it. Both families, within days of the discovery, arrive independently at the same conclusion. This relationship needs to end immediately before it goes any further, before either family has to explain to the wider community why two cousins, however distant, were allowed to keep seeing each other after the connection became known. Word travels fast in a small town. By the following week, it isn't only the immediate families who know. Aunts, uncles, family friends, the kind of extended social network that makes privacy almost impossible in a community this size, are all aware, in broad strokes, of exactly what's being discussed behind closed doors in both households. Notice something important here, something that distinguishes this obstacle sharply from every other one we've examined so far. DM's parents' objection to Chau was, underneath the surface, somewhat negotiable, a question of money, prospects, and social standing, all of which can shift over time, all of which a sufficiently successful career or a sufficiently charming son-in-law might eventually soften. And Lord Capulet's hatred of House Montague, brutal as it was still, in its origin, a human conflict between two human families, the kind of thing that could theoretically be ended by an act of will, the way the prince and the friar both hoped it eventually would be. What Thuy and Phúc are facing is none of that. A blood relationship, once established as fact within a family's own genealogical understanding, doesn't soften with time, doesn't respond to charm, doesn't change because one person earns more money or behaves more impressively than expected. It simply is what it is, fixed in the eyes of the people who believe it matters, regardless of anything either Thuy or Phúc does from this point forward. Run through the comparison one more time, because the contrast is the entire point of bringing Thuy and Phúc into this video at all. Money can be earned, a career can be built slowly, year over year, until even a skeptical family is forced to admit a son-in-law has proven himself. A feud, however old, is still, underneath everything, a story about people, and stories about people can, in theory, be rewritten by new behavior, new generosity, new acts of goodwill. The way the friar genuinely hoped a secret marriage might eventually rewrite the story between Montague and Capulet. A blood relationship cannot be rewritten by anything either party does. It is a fact about the past, fixed the moment it happened, generations before either Thuy or Phúc was born, completely outside either of their control, and completely immune to anything either of them might do to try to change how their families feel about it. This is, in other words, an obstacle with no negotiation built into its structure at all, which makes it the most extreme test case this video has presented yet for the question. Chapter 5. Left hanging in the air. Does a real, well-built foundation of intimacy actually survive contact with the most absolute kind of family opposition there is? Or does even genuine, well-earned closeness eventually buckle, once the obstacle stops being a disagreement and becomes, in the eyes of everyone around the couple, something closer to a law of nature? Hwa's parents are the ones who deliver the news to her directly, and unlike DM's mother's slow escalation over weeks, this conversation happens almost immediately, within days of the great aunt's discovery, with an urgency that makes clear how seriously the family is taking this. Her mother, in tears for most of the conversation, doesn't frame this as a preference or a worry about Hwa's future happiness. She frames it as something closer to a moral emergency, using language about ancestors, about respect for the family line, about a kind of spiritual wrongness that goes beyond ordinary disapproval into territory that feels, to Hwa, almost impossible to argue with, because it isn't framed as an opinion at all. It's framed as a fact about the universe that her mother happens to be the one delivering. What follows over the coming weeks is worth examining closely, because it's different from the pressure DM experienced, and the difference matters. DM's mother used an ultimatum and a confiscated document, a single identifiable act of leverage that DM could, in theory, push back against, negotiate around, or simply outlast. What Hwa's family does instead is slower and harder to fight directly, because it isn't built around one decisive action. It's built around constant, low-grade emotional pressure applied by almost everyone in her life simultaneously, arriving from so many directions at once that there's no single point of resistance to push back against. Her mother cries regularly, sometimes for no announced reason at all, in a way that Hwa has learned to recognize as connected to Fuck, even when nobody says his name. Tears over dinner, tears while folding laundry, a kind of ambient grief that fills the house and makes Hwa feel, whether or not it's fair, responsible for causing it. Aunts she rarely sees start calling, gently, but unmistakably steering every conversation toward concern for her future, her reputation, the well-being of a family they describe as needing her cooperation right now more than ever. Her own grandmother, whom Hwa has always been close to, stops eating properly for nearly a week, a detail the rest of the family makes sure Hwa hears about, whether or not it's framed explicitly as her fault. Nobody locks anything in a drawer. Nobody issues a single dramatic threat. Instead, Hwa finds herself increasingly isolated inside a web of quiet, sustained guilt distributed across an entire family, each person contributing one small, sincere expression of worry that, added together, becomes nearly impossible to argue with or escape from. This is worth naming directly, because it's a form of pressure that doesn't show up clearly in Driscoll and Davis's original research, which mostly measured interference as a single variable, present or absent, without distinguishing between a sharp, isolated conflict and this kind of slow, distributed siege carried out by an entire extended family, each of them acting with what they sincerely believe is love. Hwa describes this period later as feeling less like fighting one battle and more like being slowly surrounded, on every side, by people who are individually gentle and collectively suffocating. Fuck, meanwhile, is dealing with a quieter version of the same thing, compounded by something Hwa doesn't fully appreciate until much later. A growing sense, on his end, that continuing the relationship might genuinely be selfish, that loving Hwa under these circumstances means asking her to carry a weight her entire family is telling her she shouldn't have to carry, for a relationship that, from where he's standing in his lowest moments, might not be worth the cost she's paying for it. It's into this exact moment, Hwa exhausted, isolated, surrounded by grief she didn't cause but is somehow responsible for soothing, and Fuck quietly starting to wonder whether loving her means he should let her go, that we need to step back and finally answer the question. Chapter 5 left open. Where does a person's capacity to stay steady under exactly this kind of pressure actually come from? Chapter 7. The strange situation. In the 1950s and 1960s, a developmental psychologist named Mary Ainsworth, building on earlier theoretical work by John Bowlby, designed an experiment that, on its surface, has nothing to do with romantic relationships at all. Known today as the strange situation, the study placed a 1-year-old child in an unfamiliar room filled with toys, together with their mother, then introduced a stranger who sat quietly nearby, then had the mother briefly leave the room while the stranger stayed, then after a few minutes had the mother return. The entire sequence was filmed, every reaction catalogued, every reunion scored against a careful set of criteria. Ainsworth and her colleagues had developed over years of painstaking home observation before they ever brought a single child into the lab. Ainsworth and her team weren't interested in whether the babies cried when their mothers left. Almost all of them did, to some degree, and that part barely distinguished one child from another. What they were interested in was something more specific, something that turned out to matter far more than the initial distress itself. What happened when the mother came back? Some babies, upon their mother's return, were easily comforted, distressed during the separation, yes, but quickly soothed once reunited, able to return to playing and exploring the room with what looked like genuine confidence that their mother was a reliable, trustworthy source of safety. They'd cry, reach for her, settle within a minute or two, and go right back to whatever they'd been doing before, as if the disruption had been fully resolved by her simply walking back through the door. Ainsworth called this pattern secure attachment. Other babies showed a different pattern entirely. Upon reunion, they seemed almost unable to be fully comforted, clinging, distressed, simultaneously seeking contact with their mother and resisting it, arching away from a hug one moment and burying their face in her shoulder the next, as if some part of them no longer fully trusted that comfort, once offered, would actually last. Even minutes after reunion, these babies often struggled to return to playing, their attention still anchored to their mother's whereabouts, rather than the toys around them. Ainsworth called this anxious attachment. A third group showed something stranger still. These babies barely reacted to their mother's departure or her return at all. On the surface, calm, almost indifferent, continuing to play with toys as if nothing significant had happened, sometimes not even looking up when she walked back in. But physiological measurements taken during later versions of the experiment, monitoring heart rate and stress hormones like cortisol, told a different story underneath that calm exterior. These babies were just as distressed internally as the others, in some cases more so. They had simply learned, somewhere in their first year of life, that showing distress didn't reliably bring comfort. So there was no longer much point in showing it at all. The indifference wasn't an absence of feeling. It was a strategy, already in place at 12 months old, for managing feeling that experience had taught them. Nobody was going to reliably help them manage. Ainsworth called this avoidant attachment. Here is the part of this research that takes it from a curious finding about toddlers to something that should genuinely matter to you, watching this video, as an adult, whatever your relationship history looks like. Decades of follow-up research across many countries and many thousands of participants found that these same 3 patterns, secure, anxious, avoidant, don't simply disappear after infancy. They tend to persist in modified form into adult romantic relationships, shaping how a person responds instinctively to exactly the kind of stress Hoa and DM are both living through right now. Someone with an anxious attachment style, under family pressure like this, often experiences something close to what DM described, feeling after her identification card was confiscated, an intensified, almost desperate need to hold on to the relationship, a fear that any sign of distance from their partner confirms the worst fear sitting underneath anxious attachment in the first place, that people you love eventually leave. The way comfort in infancy sometimes failed to reliably arrive. Someone with an avoidant attachment style, facing the same external pressure, often does something that can look from the outside like a lack of love, but is actually closer to a learned defense mechanism, pulling back emotionally, minimizing how much the relationship actually matters to them, not protecting themselves preemptively from a loss they've half convinced themselves is coming anyway. This is part of what's happening quietly inside Phuc right now, not a weakening of his feelings for Hua, but a defensive retreat that's been shaped by patterns laid down long before he ever met her. Someone with a secure attachment style, built, according to the research, primarily through a childhood where caregivers were consistently responsive, where distress reliably brought comfort, rather than confusion or withdrawal, tends to do something neither anxious nor avoidant people manage as easily under this kind of pressure. Stay present and communicate honestly about fear without either clinging or shutting down, trusting that the relationship can survive an honest conversation about how hard things currently are. This is the missing piece of Sternberg's triangle that Chapter 5 didn't have room to address. Intimacy explains what was built between two people over time. Attachment explains how each person individually is wired to behave once that intimacy gets tested by real external pressure. It explains why two people can have built the exact same 8 months of genuine closeness and still respond completely differently to the exact same family ultimatum, based entirely on patterns formed decades earlier, in homes neither DM nor Kai, neither Hua nor Phuc, had any say in growing up inside of. It also reframes something that's easy to misread from the outside in any of the relationships this video has followed so far. When a partner pulls away under pressure, the instinct is often to read that as evidence they never loved you enough in the first place. Attachment research suggests something more complicated, and in a strange way more forgiving. Withdrawal under stress is frequently not a measurement of how much someone cares, but a reflex laid down in early childhood, operating largely outside conscious choice, that has almost nothing to do with the actual person currently standing in front of them. Phuc's quiet retreat doesn't necessarily mean he loves Hua less than DM loves Kai. It may simply mean he learned, somewhere long before he ever met her, that the safest response to overwhelming pressure is to brace for loss before it arrives rather than risk being blindsided by it. Chapter 8. What patience bought this brings us back to the decision DM made, the one this video has been holding back since the end of Chapter 5. Faced with her mother's ultimatum and her confiscated identification card, DM did something that, looking back, reflects exactly the kind of secure functioning Ainsworth's research describes. Not because DM necessarily had a perfectly secure childhood herself, but because she had, crucially, 8 months of evidence that Kai was the kind of partner who responded to her own anxiety with steadiness, rather than panic. She didn't elope. She didn't go silent and disappear from her family entirely, the way some daughters in her position eventually do. She chose instead sustained, repeated, difficult conversation, coming back to her mother again and again over the following months, not to fight, but to slowly and patiently make her case, bringing Kai along to family events despite the awkwardness, letting her parents see, in small ordinary moments instead of only as an abstract threat to the family standing, exactly who he was. It took nearly 5 months. Her mother did not change her mind quickly, and there were weeks during that period when DM genuinely doubted whether her approach would work at all, when the easier paths, eloping or simply giving in, both looked, on particularly exhausting days, more appealing than continuing to absorb her mother's disapproval one dinner at a time. There was a stretch in the 3rd month where her mother stopped speaking to her almost entirely for nearly 2 weeks, communicating only through short, functional messages about household logistics, nothing more. DM describes sitting in her car, outside her parents' apartment more than once during that period, debating whether to even go inside, wondering whether continuing to show up to a house that clearly didn't want her was stubbornness or self-respect, unable to tell the difference some days. But slowly, incrementally, watching Kai show up consistently, bringing small gifts to her mother on holidays, even when they were coldly received, fixing a leaking pipe at her parents' apartment without being asked, simply staying calm and respectful through dinners that would have tested anyone's patience. Her mother's resistance began to soften, not into enthusiasm, into something more modest, and in its own way more meaningful, a grudging, gradual willingness to stop actively blocking the relationship, to return DM's identification card without being asked again, to attend eventually a wedding she had once sworn she would refuse to acknowledge as real. DM's unresolved question, planted back in Chapter 5, resolves not with a dramatic gesture, but with something almost anticlimactic by comparison to Verona's balcony or Koloa's goose feathers, patience, repeated honesty, and 8 months of intimacy that gave her something to point to, again and again, every time her mother needed proof that this wasn't simply infatuation talking. There was no single moment of victory, no scene where her mother dramatically embraced Kai and declared herself wrong. Just a slow erosion of resistance, dinner by dinner, gesture by gesture, until one day, almost without anyone announcing it, the fight was simply over. If you've made it this far, you've now seen 2 completely different processes growing out of 2 structurally similar conflicts, and you now have in your hands 3 separate but interlocking tools that most people go their entire lives without ever putting together in one place. The Romeo and Juliet Effect, explaining why obstacles intensify feeling in the first place. Sternberg's triangle, explaining what separates a relationship built to last from one running purely on passion. And attachment theory, explaining why the exact same pressure produces wildly different behavior in different people, depending on lessons learned before any of them could even speak in full sentences. We're about to go even deeper into a harder, more uncomfortable question. When does intensity actually become something dangerous? When does passion cross over into something psychologists now call love addiction, and into a scientific twist that's going to force you to reconsider almost everything? Chapter 2 taught you. Chapter 9, when the fire stops being love. Before we go any further, it's worth asking a question this video has been circling for several chapters without ever asking directly. Is intense, obstacle-fueled passion always simply a more concentrated version of real love? Or is there a point past which it stops being love at all and starts being something closer to a different phenomenon entirely, one that happens to feel almost identical from the inside? In the 1970s and 1980s, psychologist named Stanton Peele began making an argument that at the time struck many of his colleagues as needlessly provocative, that romantic love, under certain conditions, can function in the brain and behavior of the person experiencing it almost exactly like an addiction. Not metaphorically, not as a clever turn of phrase for a magazine article, but structurally, mechanically, in terms of the actual pattern of craving, tolerance, withdrawal, and compulsive behavior that researchers had already spent decades documenting in substance use. Peele's argument rested on a distinction that's easy to miss if you've never had reason to examine your own relationships this closely. The difference between wanting someone because being with them adds something good to an already full life, and needing someone because their presence has become the only thing capable of regulating an otherwise unbearable internal state. In the first case, the relationship is additive, a source of joy layered on top of a person who would still be functional, still recognizably themselves without it. In the second case, the relationship has become load-bearing, in a way that's actually dangerous. The only thing standing between the person and a kind of psychological collapse. which means losing it, or even fearing the possibility of losing it, produces something that looks far less like sadness and far more like withdrawal. Peele pointed to specific behavioral markers that he argued should worry anyone who recognized them in their own relationship, regardless of how romantic the underlying story sounded on the surface. An increasing tolerance, where the same amount of contact, reassurance, or closeness that once felt satisfying starts to feel insufficient, requiring more and more of a partner's attention just to reach the same emotional baseline. A narrowing of the person's broader life, where friendships, hobbies, career, ambition, and other sources of meaning quietly atrophy as the relationship expands to fill more and more of the available psychological space. And, perhaps most uncomfortably, a pattern where the relationship's difficulty and the person's attachment to it move in the same direction rather than opposite ones, where, instead of pain signaling that something should change, pain instead intensifies the felt need to hold on tighter. If that last marker sounds familiar, it should. It's describing almost word for word the exact pattern Driscoll and Davis documented in 1972, the exact pattern that gave the Romeo and Juliet effect its name. And this is precisely the uncomfortable question Peele's work forces this video to sit with directly. After several chapters spent mostly celebrating the intensity that obstacles produce, what if the Romeo and Juliet effect isn't simply describing love, behaving the way love is supposed to behave under pressure? What if, in at least some of those 140 couples, what Driscoll and Davis were actually measuring was love sliding gradually, and almost invisibly, into something closer to Peele's definition of addiction, with interference acting less like an obstacle? A healthy relationship overcomes, and more like a substance whose increasing scarcity makes the craving for it more intense. It helps to see what this actually looks like in a real relationship, rather than only in the abstract language of a psychological framework. Consider a composite drawn from cases like it. A young woman, call her Lynn, who falls for a man her family strongly disapproves of, for reasons that, on paper, look almost identical to DM's. Over the course of a year, though, the shape of Lynn's relationship starts to diverge from DM's in ways that are easy to miss. At first, and unmistakable in hindsight, she stops seeing the friends who ask too many questions about the relationship, not because her partner asks her to, but because their concern has started to feel unbearable to sit with. She quietly drops a certification course she'd been excited about for years, telling herself there will be time for it later, once things with her family calm down, even though the course has nothing to do with the conflict at all. When her partner is even briefly unreachable, a delayed reply, a missed call, she describes a physical sensation of panic that has nothing to do with any specific fear about his safety, only an unbearable need to know where he is. And when a friend gently points out that the relationship seems to be taking more from her than it's giving, Lynn's response isn't reflection. It's a sharper, more urgent defense of the relationship than the comment seems to call for, as though the observation itself were the threat. None of this makes Lynch's feelings for her partner fake. It does mean that, examined against Peele's own markers, her relationship shows several of the exact warning signs he spent his career trying to teach people to recognize in themselves: tolerance, narrowing, and a difficulty attachment loop running in the wrong direction. Her story is a genuine counterexample to DM's, not because the obstacle she faced was different in kind, but because the foundation she was building underneath the intensity was thinner, and the parts of her life outside the relationship were allowed to shrink rather than being protected and maintained. It's the clearest illustration this video can offer of the actual difference between a relationship that intensifies under pressure and survives it, and one that intensifies under pressure and quietly consumes everything else around it in the process. This isn't a question with a single, clean answer, and it would be dishonest of this video to pretend otherwise. Most relationships that intensify under family pressure do not become love addictions in Peele's clinical sense. And DM's relationship with Kai, examined honestly against Peele's own markers, shows none of the warning signs he describes. Her life outside the relationship remained intact throughout the conflict with her mother. Her capacity to function, to work, to maintain other relationships never collapsed into dependence on Kai alone. What made her relationship resilient wasn't the absence of intensity. It was the presence of everything Sternberg's intimacy and secure attachment provide. Alongside that intensity, a life that stayed whole even while one part of it was under siege. But Romeo and Juliet, examined against those same markers, look considerably more troubling than 400 years of romantic retellings have generally allowed them to look. Within 4 days, each has organized their entire sense of meaning and survival around the other, to the point of literal, immediate suicide the moment the other appears to be lost. There is no remaining life outside the relationship to fall back on, because there was never time to build one in the first place. No friendships maintained independently, no ambitions pursued separately, nothing left standing once the relationship itself seemed to collapse. By Peele's own framework, this isn't simply love at its most intense. It bears an uncomfortable resemblance to exactly the kind of total, self-erasing dependency he spent his career warning people to recognize and resist. Hold that discomfort, because it's about to get considerably more complicated, in a direction almost nobody who casually cites the Romeo and Juliet effect online ever bothers to mention. Chapter 10. The Study That Failed to Replicate. In 2014, more than 40 years after Driscoll, Davis, and Lipetz published their original study, a different team of researchers, Colleen Sinclair, Christina Hood, and Brittany Wright, decided to do something deceptively simple. Try to replicate the finding. Science depends on replication, the way a bridge depends on inspection. A single study, however well designed, is a claim. A claim that survives being tested again independently, by a different team with a different sample, becomes something closer to an established fact. A claim that fails to survive that second test tells you something just as important, that the original finding may have been an artifact of that specific sample, that specific decade, or some other variable the first researchers hadn't accounted for. Sinclair and her colleagues recruited nearly 400 participants, a larger sample than the original study, and tracked their relationships over several months, using methodology updated to reflect decades of subsequent research into how relationships are best measured. They asked many of the same kinds of questions Driscoll and Davis had asked back in 1972. How much interference are you experiencing from your social network about this relationship? And how is your love for this person changing over time? What they found did not match the original study. Across their sample, increased interference from parents and other social network members was not reliably associated with increased love. In many cases, it predicted exactly what common sense and every worried parent's intuition would have predicted in the first place. Relationships under sustained social disapproval tended, over time, to weaken rather than intensify. The flame that Driscoll and Davis had measured, growing brighter under pressure. In Sinclair's much larger and more recent sample, more often simply went out. Sinclair and her colleagues proposed a different name for what they believed was actually driving relationship outcomes, one that points in almost the opposite direction from the original Romeo and Juliet effect. The social network effect. Their argument, built on decades of additional research into how relationships actually function day to day, was straightforward, and once you hear it, almost uncomfortably obvious. Romantic relationships don't exist in a vacuum, sustained purely by the two people inside them. They're held up in large part by an entire surrounding scaffolding of friends, family, and community. People who provide practical support, emotional validation, a sense that this relationship fits into the rest of a person's life rather than existing apart from it. When that scaffolding actively works against a relationship instead of supporting it, the relationship doesn't simply have to survive an internal test of its own strength. It has to survive without most of the infrastructure that ordinarily helps relationships survive at all. Without parents offering encouragement, without friends validating the choice, without family gatherings that naturally fold a new partner into the existing fabric of a person's life. According to the social network effect, what actually predicts whether a relationship lasts isn't how intensely the couple feels about each other in the moment. It's how much support that couple is receiving or not receiving from everyone surrounding them. This is a genuinely uncomfortable twist to sit with, because it means the single most quoted, most internet-famous finding in the entire psychology of forbidden love. The finding this video spent an entire chapter explaining in detail, failed to replicate at scale more than 40 years later. With a larger and more carefully designed study, it raises an obvious, slightly embarrassing question. Why does the Romeo and Juliet effect still get cited constantly, in articles, in videos, in casual conversation, as if it were a settled, reliable finding, when the most rigorous attempt to confirm it produced the opposite result? Part of the answer is simply how science actually moves through culture, as opposed to how it moves through academic journals. A catchy, intuitive, well-named finding from 1972 has had over 50 years to embed itself in popular psychology, repeated in book after book, article after article, each retelling rarely bothering to check whether the original finding ever actually held up under further scrutiny. A more cautious, more accurately named 2014 finding, lacking a built-in literary reference as memorable as Shakespeare's two most famous characters, simply never had the same cultural staying power, regardless of how much more rigorous the underlying science actually was. But there's a more interesting answer underneath that one, and it's the answer this video has actually been building toward quietly across every story you've watched unfold so far. The two studies may not be straightforwardly contradictory at all. They may simply be describing two different things, both real, both measurable, that get tangled together under casual observation and pulled apart only when researchers control carefully enough for the variables surrounding them. Think about the difference between Driscoll's 140 couples in 1972 and Sinclair's nearly 400 participants in 2014. The earlier study was smaller and crucially didn't separate out what kind of interference each couple was facing, or how that interference interacted with how well established the relationship already was. The later study, larger and more methodologically careful, was better positioned to detect the average effect across many different kinds of relationships, many different intensities of interference, many different durations and depths of existing intimacy. An average, by its nature, hides real variation underneath it. It's entirely possible, and this is the synthesis several relationship researchers have proposed in the years since both studies were published, that interference genuinely does intensify passion in the short term, the way Driscoll's data and the Bridge experiment both suggest, while simultaneously, over a longer horizon, eroding the relationship's actual durability, the way Sinclair's data suggests, precisely because that intensified passion is being asked to carry the entire weight of a relationship that's been cut off from the social scaffolding it needs to actually last. Put plainly, the spark goes up, the structure goes down. Both things can be true in the same relationship at the same time, and that is exactly what makes obstacles such a genuinely dangerous variable to introduce into a relationship's early development. Not because they kill love outright, the way Sinclair's headline finding might suggest. Not because they simply make love stronger, the way Driscoll's headline finding might suggest, but because they do both things simultaneously, in a way that can fool the two people inside the relationship into mistaking the rising spark for evidence that the eroding structure isn't actually happening. This is exactly the gap DM closed, almost certainly without ever having read either study. The spark with Kai absolutely rose under her mother's pressure, exactly as Driscoll's research would predict. But instead of letting that rising spark stand in for the social scaffolding, Sinclair's research says relationships actually need. DM spent 5 months actively rebuilding that scaffolding herself, bringing Kai to family events, accumulating small proofs of his character, in front of the very people whose support the relationship was missing, slowly converting her mother from an active obstacle back into eventually something closer to support. She didn't simply trust the intensity. She used the intensity as motivation to do the much slower, much less romantic work of repairing the network around the relationship, which is precisely the variable, Sinclair's research says, actually determines whether love like this survives. Romeo and Juliet never had that option. 4 days left no time to rebuild any scaffolding at all, even if either of them had understood the project needed doing. Which means the most accurate way to describe what happened in Verona isn't that their love was too intense to survive. It's that their love never had the chance to do the unglamorous, patient work that turns intensity into something durable. The exact work we're about to watch, demonstrated in its purest possible form, by a couple who never had any obstacles to overcome at all, and built something that, by every measure that actually matters, outlasted Verona's most famous romance by nearly 5 decades. Chapter 11. 50 years without a balcony bar and Kuang have been married for 50 years. They met in 1974, 1 year before the war ended, in a city still reorganizing itself around the constant practical fact of conflict. He was 25, a teacher of mathematics at a secondary school. She was 22, and working at a textile factory 2 kilometers from the school. They were introduced by a mutual acquaintance, not through a party or a romantic accident, not through a crashed family gathering or a clash of swords, but through the straightforward, unromantic kind of matchmaking that was still entirely ordinary in their social circle at the time. Someone decided they seemed compatible, asked both of them separately if they'd be willing to meet, and they both said yes. Because that was how most people in their position went about finding a partner. Neither of them saw any particular reason to feel differently about it. Their first meeting lasted about 2 hours, over tea, in a house that belonged to the mutual acquaintance who'd arranged the introduction. They talked about their work, their families, where they'd grown up, whether they liked the rain, the kind of conversation that, filtered through the lens of everything this video has taught you about passion and neurochemistry and misattributed arousal, sounds like almost nothing. No adrenaline, no forbidden garden, no racing heart manufactured by danger. Just 2 people drinking tea, taking careful stock of each other in the most ordinary way imaginable. Their second meeting, a week later, lasted slightly longer. There was no moment either of them would later describe as a lightning strike, no conversation that went on until 3 in the morning, no impulse to climb walls or speak in verse. By their own account, asked about this period of their courtship now, at 70 and 75, they liked each other. They got along, they could see without any great difficulty that their values were compatible, that they had similar ideas about how to live a life. that the conversations were easy enough to imagine having for a long time. They got married 8 months after their first meeting. Here is the question this video has been quietly waiting to ask. Across several chapters of star-crossed lovers and forbidden kisses and parents confiscating identification documents, is a relationship that begins this way, this undramatically, this plainly and practically, actually less real than what Romeo felt for Juliet? Or has the culture's entire habit of treating the former as settling and the latter as the genuine article actually gotten the relationship between intensity and quality precisely backwards? Because here is what 50 years looks like in practice, and it's worth being specific about it, rather than reaching for easy sentiment. Ba and Kuang raised 3 children in a city that was still rebuilding itself throughout most of their early marriage. Streets torn up, goods scarce, a steady, low-level stress of daily life in a country, reorganizing its entire economy from scratch. They survived the particular financial hardship of the late 1970s and early 1980s in Vietnam, the kind of pressure that tests a marriage far more thoroughly than any romantic obstacle ever could. Because it isn't dramatically all or nothing, it's grinding and slow, and it strips away every luxury, including the luxury of treating a marriage as primarily an emotional project. Their middle child was seriously ill for nearly 2 years when he was small, a period both of them still describe as the hardest of their lives. And they made it through the other side of that period, still married, still functional, still able to be kind to each other on days when kindness was genuinely difficult. Not because they had some unusual reservoir of romantic feeling to draw on from a stormy courtship, but because they had built, over years of ordinary shared labor, a kind of institutional knowledge of each other. Who gets short-tempered when scared? Who needs to talk and who needs silence? Who makes decisions when both are too exhausted to think clearly? The kind of knowledge that nobody builds in 4 days, and that no amount of obstacle-fueled passion can substitute for. John Gottman, a psychologist who spent 40 years studying couples in what he called his love lab at the University of Washington, identified many of the specific behaviors that actually predict whether a marriage lasts, not whether it starts with fireworks, but whether it survives. He found that what distinguished stable long-term couples wasn't the absence of conflict, wasn't shared hobbies, wasn't even how much they said, "I love you." It was something almost tediously practical, where the partners, in hundreds of small daily interactions, turned toward each other's bids for connection. A comment about the weather, a nudge about something funny, a small complaint about the day, met with attention rather than dismissal. Not grand gestures, thousands of small ones, accumulated over years, each one either adding to or subtracting from what Gottman called an emotional bank account. Ba and Kuang, who have been making small deposits into that account for 50 years, are the empirical endpoint of exactly the process Gottman spent 4 decades describing. None of this is to claim that their marriage was uniformly happy, or that every year was better than the last, or that 50 years of anything is automatically an endorsement of the form it took. Ba and Kuang, when asked honestly, are the first to admit that there were years that were harder than they'd want to dwell on at length. Stretches where the marriage felt more like an infrastructure they were maintaining than a relationship they were choosing. What they don't claim, and what's important here, is that those difficult stretches felt like evidence of some fundamental failure at the foundation, because the foundation was precisely what they'd been careful, from the beginning, to build practically and honestly, rather than to feel their way into during 4 days of dazzling passion. Helen Fisher, a biological anthropologist at Rutgers University, who has spent decades studying what actually happens in the brain during different stages of love and attachment, offers the scientific language for what Ba and Kuang built, and for why it behaves so differently under pressure than the experience Romeo and Juliet were having in their garden. The early, intense, obstacle-fueled passion that characterizes forbidden love. The racing heart, the obsessive thinking, the sense that this particular person is the only thing that matters in the world, is, in Fisher's research, driven primarily by elevated dopamine, low serotonin, and the activation of brain circuits almost identical to those lit up by cocaine or methamphetamine in neuroimaging studies. Fisher and her colleagues scanned the brains of people who described themselves as newly and intensely in love, showed them photographs of their beloved, and watched the areas that lit up, the same dopamine-dense reward circuitry associated with craving, motivation, and the neurological mechanism of addiction. This isn't a poetic metaphor. The same reward circuitry, the same craving mechanism, the same tolerance curve, where you need more and more of the stimulus to get the same internal effect, shows up in brain scans of people describing being intensely, recently in love as it does, in people describing active stimulant use. This is what Peel was gesturing toward 40 years before the neuroimaging technology existed to confirm it. He was right about the structure, even before anyone could point to the specific circuits. The low serotonin component adds another layer that most popular retellings of Fisher's work skip entirely. Serotonin in the brain is associated with, among other things, a capacity to hold the world in perspective, to see circumstances and relationships in their actual proportions, rather than through the distorting lens of an emotion currently running at maximum intensity. People with clinically low serotonin can't do this as easily, which is why for decades, low serotonin has been associated with a range of conditions involving the inability to stop fixating on a thought, a feeling, or a perceived threat, regardless of how much the rational mind recognizes that the fixation is disproportionate. Fisher's research found that people in the early stage of intense romantic love show serotonin levels strikingly similar to those seen in people diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder. They literally, neurochemically, cannot stop thinking about the person they love, not because of a character flaw, and not simply because the feeling is overwhelming, but because the brain chemistry currently running through them is, in a measurable and specific way, physiologically organized around fixation. But here is the part of Fisher's research that almost nobody quotes when they're citing the dopamine and love connection, the part that matters most for where this video is about to go. Those same brain circuits, in relationships that survive into long-term stable attachment, gradually shift. The dopamine spike settles. Serotonin normalizes. What rises in its place, sustaining a different but measurably real connection, is a neurochemical profile dominated by oxytocin and vasopressin, compounds associated not with craving and urgency and obsessive focus, but with warmth, calm, and a sense of deep, reliable safety in the presence of another person. Fisher calls these two separate systems in the brain's approach to love passionate love and companionate love. And the shift from one to the other, she argues, is not a loss. It's a maturation from something that has to be that intense, because it hasn't yet built the infrastructure for anything steadier, into something that doesn't need the intensity anymore, because the infrastructure is already there. Ba and Kuang, without any neuroimaging equipment and without having read any of Fisher's papers, built their way directly to the second state without spending years in the first one, which, rather than making their marriage thinner or more ordinary than a love story with obstacles, makes it, in Fisher's own terms, a 50-year example of the exact destination that more dramatic romances are, at their best, trying to reach. This is the distinction the entire video has been working toward. The one that sits underneath the Romeo and Juliet effect, and Sinclair's replication and Sternberg's triangle, and Ainsworth's babies in the laboratory, all at once. The kind of love that feels the most powerful, the most urgent, the most worth telling stories about, isn't necessarily the kind of love that works. And the kind of love that works, in every measurable, documented, long-term study of what happy, stable relationships actually look like, tends to feel, from the outside, and often from the inside, considerably less like the kind of love that gets turned into a 400-year-old legend. But there's one more question this video needs to answer before it can let you go, and it's the one that started all of this, the one asked in the very first minute. Why? Given everything you now know about obstacles and intensity, and misattributed arousal and the neurochemistry of craving, does the story of Romeo and Juliet still make people cry? Not because they don't know how it ends, but because something in that story, after 400 years, in 100 different languages, and through every version of this argument we've traced across this video, still reaches in and finds something true. Chapter 12. The letter that didn't arrive. Let's go back to Verona for the last time. Not to the party, not to the garden, but to the part of the play that almost every summary rushes through on the way to the final scene. The part that actually explains everything this video has been building toward. Juliet has taken the friar's sleeping potion. She lies in the family tomb, to all appearances dead. The plan hatched between her, the friar, and a message being carried to Romeo in exile is that Romeo will receive the letter in time, come to the tomb, understand she's only sleeping, and be there when she wakes. It's not a perfect plan. Friar Lawrence himself knows it's not a perfect plan, but it's the only one left, given that every other option available to two 14-year-olds in 16th century Verona has been exhausted. The letter doesn't arrive, not because of malice, not because of any dramatic act of sabotage or cruel intervention by either family. It doesn't arrive because of a quarantine. A plague outbreak in another city delays the messenger, who is himself held inside a quarantined house, along with the letter he's carrying, not knowing what it contains or why the timing might matter. Nobody in the administrative machinery of a city managing a disease outbreak is thinking about two teenagers in a tomb. They're thinking about containing a plague, the ordinary, entirely reasonable, entirely impersonal process of managing a public health emergency, applied without any awareness that a girl's life depends on a message reaching one specific person in the next 48 hours, produces a delay of perhaps a day, one day. That is the entire margin this story operates on. Romeo gets news of Juliet's apparent death from a different source, a friend operating in good faith who has absolutely no reason to doubt what he's seen with his own eyes, and no way of knowing that what he's seen isn't what it appears to be. Romeo leaves for Verona immediately. He buys poison along the way, not in a dramatic moment of theatrical despair, but in the same focused, purposeful way a person makes any practical preparation for something they believe is unavoidable. He arrives at the tomb, finds what looks like a dead girl, and swallows the poison standing over her body. Juliet wakes minutes later, finds him dying beside her, and uses his dagger on herself. The friar arrives shortly after both of them are gone. Now hold the entire span of this video in your mind at once. Every piece of research and every story you've followed, and ask yourself the question the opening of this video promised you an answer to. Why does this still make people cry? It's not because the love was real in any verified, tested, time-proven sense. We've now established, in some detail, that 4 days of danger-fueled passion tells you almost nothing about the actual compatibility of two people, that the brain chemistry running through both of them was chemically indistinguishable from the early stages of addiction. It's not because the obstacle was unjust in some uniquely terrible way. Every person in this video has faced an obstacle of comparable brutality, and most of them are still alive, still navigating it, some of them winning. It's not even because the ending is surprising. You knew how it ended before this video started. Everyone does, in every country that has ever staged this play or adapted this story. In the 4 centuries since Shakespeare wrote it, not one audience has ever gone in hoping for a different ending and been surprised by the one they got. The ending is known, and it still lands every time, in every language, in every century since it was written, which means the emotional effect this story produces cannot be explained by its plot. It's what happens that makes people cry. It's what the plot represents, what it's about at a level below the specific events, that reaches past the rational mind and touches something else entirely. People cry at Romeo and Juliet for the same reason they cry at news footage of an ambulance arriving 1 minute too late, or at the story of a letter written but never sent, or at any account of a catastrophe that turned on a single, preventable, meaningless accident of timing. Not because they are sad about these specific people or these specific events, but because they are sad, in some wordless, half-conscious way, about the structure itself, about the fact that the world is built in such a way that this kind of gap is possible, that it is always possible, that no amount of love or intention or effort makes any of us fully safe from the consequences of information that fails to arrive when it's needed. Here is the answer, the one that has been sitting underneath this entire video since the first question was asked. Romeo and Juliet makes people cry, not because it's a love story. It makes people cry because it's a story about a message that doesn't arrive in time. And that is a story every human being on earth has lived, in some version that has nothing to do with poison or daggers, or a friar's quarantined letter. The person you didn't tell how you felt until it was too late. The conversation you kept putting off until the opening for it closed. The apology you were already forming in your head on the drive home. At the exact moment the other person was deciding it was never going to come. The reconciliation that was already forming in one person's mind at the exact moment the other person gave up. The relationship that might have survived if one person had known something the other person knew. If the timing had shifted by a day, if the message had arrived. The grandmother who died without knowing you forgave her, not because you hadn't forgiven her, but because you were always going to tell her next time. And then there wasn't a next time. The friendship that ended, because both people were too proud to reach out first. And then the moment when reaching out would have been natural passed. And then another one passed. Until one day the gap had grown so wide that bridging it would have required addressing the gap itself, which neither of them was willing to do. So the friendship simply ended, without anyone ever formally deciding it had. This is what the story is actually about. Not passion, not forbidden love, not the beauty of dying for someone, but the unbearable gap between what was true and what was known, in the moment it mattered most. And all the ordinary ways that life, a quarantine, a misunderstanding, an assumption based on incomplete information, a letter entrusted to the wrong messenger on the wrong day, fills that gap with consequences nobody intended and nobody can take back. That's why it still works. That's why it will always work. The specific architecture of this tragedy, 2 people separated by circumstance. One of them acting on information that is almost but not quite current, the other arriving too late to correct it, is not a Renaissance artifact. It's a human design flaw, built into every relationship that has ever existed between people who are not omniscient, which is all of them, always, without exception. Now walk back to Koloa one last time, and look at the goose feathers along the road to the sea through exactly that lens. Chau didn't betray her father. She didn't know she was betraying her father, not the information she acted on, that the man asking about her cloak was her husband, who loved her and wanted to find her if they were ever separated, was true. As far as she could tell, In every way it was possible for her to verify. What she didn't know, and couldn't know, because Thuy was carrying a version of reality she had never been given access to, was that the context inside which his question made sense was not the context she understood herself to be living in. She dropped the feathers faithfully, in complete accordance with a promise she'd made to the person she trusted most in the world. The tragedy is not that she broke faith with anyone. The tragedy is that she kept faith perfectly, devotedly, all the way to the sea, with a version of her marriage that only she believed in. Both stories are, underneath all the swords and the daggers and the crossbow and the poison, stories about the gap between what people know and what is actually true in the moments that determine everything. And both stories have endured, not because audiences find that gap romantic, but because audiences recognize it immediately and viscerally as one of the fundamental conditions of human intimacy. You never fully know the person you love. You never have access to the version of reality they're operating in. And the distance between your understanding of what's happening and their understanding of what's happening, however small, however ordinary, can at any moment produce consequences that feel, in retrospect, like they should have been preventable. If only someone had said something, or arrived somewhere, or sent a letter one day earlier. This is what Thuy, a Vietnamese psychologist and relationship educator, whose work sits at precisely the intersection of traditional Vietnamese family dynamics and modern attachment science, describes as the most common source of preventable relationship tragedy he encounters in his practice. Not dramatic family feuds, not forbidden blood connections, not parents confiscating identification papers, but the far more ordinary and far more pervasive tragedy of two people who genuinely care for each other, failing to communicate something essential that both of them assumed the other already knew, until the gap between their respective understandings of the relationship becomes too wide to bridge without someone getting hurt. In the specific cultural context he works in, families navigating the tension between traditional Vietnamese expectations and the increasing individualism of younger generations, this failure mode tends to take a particular shape, worth describing, precisely because it shows up form most people would never recognize as the same underlying tragedy as Verona's. A son who wants to pursue a career in a creative field, knowing his parents expect him to join the family business, who spends years performing contentment he doesn't feel because every time he's considered having the direct conversation, he's concluded that this is not the right moment, that there's too much else going on, that his parents are stressed, that it can wait. A daughter who has been unhappy in a marriage for years, who never tells her husband directly, because the cultural framework she grew up inside doesn't have a clear and accepted script for how a wife expresses marital unhappiness to a husband without it becoming an accusation, so she finds other ways to signal it indirectly, through absence and withdrawal, that he either doesn't read or reads differently than she intends. The message exists. It's being transmitted in the only form available to it, given the constraints both people are operating under. It simply never quite arrives in the form that would allow the other person to act on it before the window closes. He talks about couples who spend years silently accumulating resentments, neither of them ever names directly, each one assuming the other must understand what's wrong, because the signals seem so obvious from the inside, each one waiting for the other to initiate the conversation they both need to have, until eventually one of them stops waiting, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet, invisible internal decision that reorganizes all their energy toward a future that doesn't include the other person anymore. The other person finds out months later, sometimes years later, and experiences something that feels, from the inside, indistinguishable from an ambush, even though from the outside, every signal had technically been there the entire time. Chapter 13. What Hoa and Phuc chose to say now come back to Hoa and Phuc, still surrounded, still exhausted, their own resolution still unwritten. Because it's in exactly this exhausted, cornered moment that the two of them do the one thing that separates their story from every failure of communication Chun Hiu Tri describes, and from the specific failure that killed Romeo and Juliet. Late one night, after another difficult week, Hoa finally says out loud the thing she's been too proud, or too frightened, or simply too tired to say directly until now. She tells Phuc that she has noticed his withdrawal, that she has felt him pulling away in small ways for weeks, and that she needs to know honestly whether he still wants this, because she cannot keep absorbing pressure from her entire family, for a relationship he's quietly deciding, on his own, might not be worth it. It is not an accusation delivered gently. It is a frightened, direct question asked at real risk to both of them, because asking it means she might hear an answer she cannot bear. Phuc's response is the hinge this chapter turns on. He could retreat further, the way his own attachment patterns have been quietly pulling him to do for weeks. Instead, he tells her the truth he's been afraid to say, because saying it would make him need something from her at the exact moment she can least afford to give it. He tells her that he has been wondering whether loving her means he should let her go, that watching her exhausted by a fight he feels responsible for causing has made him question in his lowest moments whether continuing this relationship is selfish. And he tells her, in the same breath, that he does not actually want to let her go, that the wondering has been fear talking, not preference. Hoa tells Phuc that the silence from him during the worst weeks of her family's pressure was harder to bear than the pressure itself, because she kept reading it as confirmation that he was already half gone, that his family's position had reached him, that he was slowly agreeing with them, that the relationship was quietly ending from his side, even while they were both officially still in it. Both of them are telling the other something the other didn't know. Both of them are, in real time, doing the one thing the friar's letter failed to do, getting the message through before the window closes. This is the moment Chun Hiu Tri would describe, in clinical terms, as the couple successfully reducing the gap between their respective understandings of the relationship, each one making the other's internal state legible, at a moment when remaining illegible would have been the easier and more self-protective choice. It is not romantic in the way the balcony scene is romantic. There's no poetry in it. There's no danger, no racing heart manufactured by an enemy household beyond the walls. There's just two people sitting somewhere ordinary, being precisely honest with each other about something frightening and important at the exact moment it needs to be said. What happens to their family situation isn't a fairy tale reversal. Hua's great-aunt doesn't change her view. Several of the older relatives on both sides remain unconvinced, and say so whenever the topic comes up, which is less frequently over the following months, but never stops entirely. What changes is something more practical, and in its own way, more durable. Both families gradually accept that their leverage over the two of them has a limit, that this particular couple is not going to be moved by pressure alone, and that the choice between maintaining a relationship with their children and maintaining their position on this genealogical question is a choice they are going to have to make. It takes longer than either Hoa or Phuc would have preferred. It costs Hoa, in particular, a period of genuine estrangement from her grandmother, the person she was closest to in her extended family, that doesn't fully resolve during the timeline of this story, and may not fully resolve for years. Nobody wins cleanly. There is no scene where the great-aunt smiles and says she was wrong. There is just the slow, undramatic process of life continuing in both households, and both families eventually making their peace, in different ways and at different speeds, with a reality they couldn't prevent. Thuy and Phuc move to a city where neither family has deep roots. Not because they're fleeing, or at least that's how they describe it, but because the distance makes certain conversations easier not to have, and makes the question of who approves of whom slightly less immediate on a day-to-day basis than it would be in the small town, where everyone's ancestry is common knowledge, and the great aunt's position on the matter is publicly understood. What their life in that city actually looks like in the first year is worth describing without sentimentality. It's harder than either of them anticipated, not because they don't love each other, but because the social isolation, Sinclair's research predicts, is real and consistent, and requires active management in a way neither of them fully understood when they made the decision. Building a new social network from scratch as an adult couple in an unfamiliar city takes longer than it looks like it should, and requires a different kind of effort than either of them had previously been asked for. They find a community through shared activities, slowly, one friendship at a time. Thuy finds a new school where she teaches. Phuc finds a workshop space where he can operate his repair business. They begin, incrementally, to build exactly the kind of scaffolding around their relationship that Sinclair's research describes. One relationship at a time, one shared dinner at a time, one person at a time who knows both of them, and can offer the kind of external network-level support their families, for the time being, are unable to provide. It is, by every measurable standard, a more difficult version of life than the one they would have had if their families had simply accepted the relationship from the beginning. It is also, by their own account, a life they chose with full information, knowing what it would cost, after a conversation in which both of them finally said everything that needed to be said before the window closed. That conversation is what made it possible for the choice to be real rather than reactive. And that, more than any other single element in this video, is the difference between a couple navigating an obstacle and a legend told about people who ran out of time to have it. This is what Thuy means when he talks about couples who make it through family opposition, not that they found a way to make the opposition disappear, or performed some heroic act that forced the families to relent, but that they kept the gap between their internal understandings of the relationship narrow enough, honest enough, and current enough that when the external pressure peaked, both of them were operating in the same story. Not Michoyo's mistake of trusting someone whose version of the story she never had access to. Not Romeo's catastrophe of acting on information that was 1 hour too old. Just two people in the same room, telling each other the truth in time. Chapter 14. 4 couples. 1 frame. Now put all 4 couples in the same frame. The way this video has been moving toward since the beginning, and the shape of what actually separates the ones who make it from the ones who don't finally becomes possible to see clearly. Romeo and Juliet passion at maximum intensity, and almost nothing else. No time for intimacy to build. No social scaffolding to hold the relationship up when the intensity found nowhere safe to go. No capacity for the specific kind of direct, precise communication that might have, even in the 4 days they had, closed a gap before it became irreversible. What they had was real, in the neurochemical sense Fisher describes. The dopamine spike, the obsessive fixation, the brain chemistry indistinguishable from early addiction. All of it genuine. All of it overwhelming from the inside, and genuinely, measurably amplified by the danger they were living inside. Exactly as Driscoll documented, the misattribution of arousal running full tilt through every moment they spent together. What they didn't have was any of the infrastructure that would have allowed that passion to survive contact with the specific, ordinary, non-romantic catastrophe that actually killed them. A quarantine, a delayed letter, and a final irreversible decision made on information that was 1 hour out of date. Chau had intimacy, months of it, carefully and sincerely built, a full, slow architecture of Sternberg's second component assembled through an entire shared domestic life, but built inside a structure designed from the beginning to weaponize exactly that intimacy, which meant the trust that should have been her relationship's greatest asset became instead its most catastrophic liability. The lesson her story carries isn't that trust is dangerous. It's that trust built without any independent source of information about the person you're trusting, without the social networks Sinclair describes, without anyone outside the relationship who knows both people and can validate what one of them is experiencing, is structurally vulnerable in a way that no amount of sincere feeling can compensate for. She was, from the very beginning, the only person in her own life who believed her marriage was what she thought it was. And that isolation, the absence of the very scaffolding Sinclair's research insists relationships need to survive, was the mechanism of the tragedy, not the love itself. Thuy and Fuchs had, that Romeo and Juliet catastrophically lacked, the willingness to name what was actually happening internally at the moment it needed to be named, even when naming it was frightening, and the easier option was silence and distance. What they sacrificed to keep that communication open was the full version of the social scaffolding Sinclair's research says relationships need. They bought their relationship's survival at the cost of the easy, frictionless family support that would have made the early years of that relationship considerably easier to live inside. It was a real cost, not a metaphorical one. They paid it knowingly, and whether it was worth it is a question only they can answer. And the honest answer, this far into their story, is probably still not fully clear. And DM and Kai, the couple this video has returned to most often, the one whose story most closely models what the research actually recommends, had ultimately all three components in imperfect but sufficient quantities. 8 months of real intimacy before the pressure arrived. Enough secure functioning between them that the crisis intensified their commitment instead of fracturing it. The social scaffolding rebuilt slowly and patiently through 5 months of unglamorous, unromantic work, and the communication to stay honest with each other about what the cost of all of that was, without either of them pretending it was easy when it wasn't. None of these are perfect stories. The research doesn't promise perfect stories. It just describes, as accurately as the current state of human understanding allows, which variables tend to matter most, and in what order, and why the variables that feel the most significant from the inside. The intensity, the passion, the feeling that this particular person is unlike anyone you've ever known, are structurally the ones most likely to be manufactured by circumstances rather than revealed by time. And it describes, with uncomfortable precision, why the variable that actually matters most. Communication honest and direct, and offered at the moment it needs to be offered, rather than the moment it's comfortable to offer, is the one that feels the least romantic, the least worth a 400-year legend, and the most worth practicing every single ordinary day with the specific person currently in front of you. Ba and Kuang, who met over tea on a quiet afternoon in 1974 and said exactly what they meant to each other from the beginning, and have been doing so imperfectly but consistently for 50 years since, are not the romantic ideal the culture gave you. They don't have a story worth dramatizing. They don't have obstacles worth writing plays about. They have something considerably less glamorous and considerably more durable. A 50-year record of letters, not always on time, not always in the form the other person needed, but consistently, stubbornly in the direction of closing the gap, rather than leaving it open, which is the only thing the research says actually matters in the end. Here is the final thing this video wants to leave with you, before the 3 lessons at the end. The reason Romeo and Juliet is still being performed, still being adapted, still being taught in schools and staged in parks and turned into films in every decade since Shakespeare wrote it, isn't because it's a good model for how to love. It isn't. It's a spectacularly bad model for how to love. And this video has spent the better part of 3 hours establishing exactly why. The love was real. The obstacles amplified it. The brain chemistry was indistinguishable from addiction. The social network that could have held the relationship up was never rebuilt after it was lost. The communication that might have saved both of them never arrived. 2 people who, given more time in better circumstances, might have built something that actually lasted, died instead because one of them acted on information that was 1 hour out of date. It endures because it is a perfect model for what love is afraid of. The message that doesn't arrive, the window that closes before anyone knows it was closing, the version of events you never got to correct because you were never told in time. At the moment, your version and the other person's version had stopped being the same story. That fear doesn't go away because you understand the Romeo and Juliet effect, or Sternberg's triangle, or the difference between oxytocin and dopamine. But understanding those things gives you something Romeo never had, something Chau never had, something the friar never had when he handed his letter to a messenger who didn't know what it contained. A few extra seconds of clarity in the moments that matter to close the gap yourself before something ordinary and impersonal and indifferent closes it for you. Chapter 15, 3 lessons. If you've stayed with this video all the way to here, you deserve something more useful than another retelling of a tragedy. You deserve the 3 lessons this entire journey, through Verona and Koloa and the Arabian desert, through a bridge in Canada and a bank branch in Thuy, through a kindergarten classroom and a mechanic's garage, through 50 years of tea and small kindnesses, was actually building toward. The first lesson is this: intensity is not evidence. The fact that a feeling is overwhelming tells you almost nothing about whether it is trustworthy. Driscoll and Davis proved that obstacles reliably intensify romantic feeling. The bridge experiment proved that the body cannot always tell the difference between fear and attraction, and will confidently, sincerely mislabel one as the other. Peel proved that some of the most intense attachments people ever form are the ones doing the most damage to the rest of their lives. None of this means intense feelings are fake. It means intensity is a signal that needs to be checked against other evidence before you build a life on top of it, the same way a compass needs to be checked against a map before you trust it to get you somewhere real. If you notice that your feelings for someone spike specifically when your family disapproves, when a friend expresses concern, when the relationship faces some outside threat, that isn't proof the relationship is special. It's exactly the pattern the research predicts, and it's worth asking, honestly and without judgment toward yourself, how much of what you're feeling would still be there on an ordinary Tuesday with no obstacle in the room at all. The second lesson is this: obstacles are a stress test, not a decoration. They will reveal what's already there in a relationship, for better or worse, faster and more thoroughly than an easy, uncomplicated courtship ever could. DM's relationship with Kai survived her family's pressure, not because the pressure made it stronger by itself, in the simple, direct way the original 1972 study seemed to suggest, but because there was already 8 months of real intimacy and functional attachment underneath the pressure for the pressure to reveal. Hua and Fuck's relationship survived a genealogical taboo, not because obstacles are inherently good for love, but because they had underneath the crisis the specific capacity to communicate, honestly at the exact moment silence would have been easier. If you are facing an obstacle right now, in your own relationship, the question worth asking isn't whether the intensity you're feeling is real. It almost certainly is. The question worth asking is what the obstacle is revealing about the foundation that was already there before the obstacle arrived. And whether that foundation, examined honestly, has the kind of intimacy, communication, and social support that the research says actually predicts durability. The third lesson is this: the gap will always be trying to open, and closing it is a daily practice, not a single act. Romeo and Juliet's deaths came down, in the end, to a single specific gap, a letter that didn't arrive in time. But that gap was already present throughout their entire relationship, present in every conversation they never had time to have, every ordinary day they never got to share, every piece of context about each other they never got the chance to accumulate. Chau's tragedy came down to a gap between the reality she believed she was living in and the reality her husband actually inhabited, a gap that widened invisibly for months before it finally mattered. Thuy and Phúc closed their own gap on purpose, at real emotional risk, at a moment when it would have been far easier to let the silence continue. Ba and Cuong have been closing that gap, in small, unglamorous, daily ways, for 50 years, which is the only reason there's still a marriage left to close it inside of. None of these lessons are as satisfying as a balcony scene. None of them will end up carved into a bronze statue that tourists line up to touch. But they are, as far as the accumulated research on this subject currently allows anyone to say with confidence, considerably more likely to get you to your own version of Ba and Cuong's 50 years than anything Romeo or Juliet ever said to each other in that garden. Closing so, why does Romeo and Juliet still break the world, 400 years after it was written, in every language it's ever been translated into? Not because it teaches us how to love, because it shows us, with more precision than almost any other story humanity has ever told itself, exactly what love is up against. A nervous system that mistakes danger for destiny, a heart that cannot always tell the difference between fear and desire, a trust that can be built so completely it becomes the very thing used to destroy the person who gave it, and a world that will, with complete indifference to what's actually at stake, sometimes simply fail to deliver the one message that would have changed everything, one day, 1 hour, one conversation too late. You have now something none of the people in this story had when they needed it most. You have the vocabulary for what's happening in your own chest the next time an obstacle makes someone feel more urgent, more necessary, more like destiny than reason would otherwise suggest. You have Sternberg's triangle to ask yourself honestly which of the 3 components you actually have with this person and which ones you're assuming will simply arrive later because the passion feels so complete right now. You have Ainsworth's research to understand why you, or the person you love, responds to pressure by clinging, or withdrawing, or staying steady, and why none of those responses are a verdict on how much either of you actually cares. You have Peele's markers to check your own relationship against, honestly, without defensiveness, the way DM's relationship passed that check and Lynn's, in our composite example, did not. You have Sinclair's social network effect to remind you that a relationship needs more than 2 people feeling something for each other. It needs the scaffolding of a life around it, and if that scaffolding has been damaged or removed, rebuilding it is not optional, it's the actual work. And you have most of all the plain, unglamorous, thoroughly unromantic lessons sitting underneath every single story this video has told. Say the thing, send the letter. Have the conversations you keep deciding isn't the right moment for. Ask the question you're afraid of the answer to. The way Thuy finally asked Phúc, before the gap between what you know and what's true gets wide enough that nothing either of you says afterward can close it again. Verona's tomb is not a template. It's a warning, 400 years old and still, somehow, exactly on time. Take the warning, skip the tomb. And if there's a letter you've been meaning to send to someone you love, about something that matters, that you've been telling yourself there's still time for, this is the moment in the story where you send it. Epilogue. If you're watching this because of your own situation, some of the people watching this video are watching out of pure curiosity, the way you might watch any deep dive into a story you already loved. But some of you are watching because a version of this is actually happening in your life right now, and you clicked on a video about Romeo and Juliet because some part of you recognized the shape of your own situation in the thumbnail, even if you couldn't have named exactly why. If that's you, here is something more direct than the rest of this video has offered, built out of everything you've just spent the last few hours learning. Start with an honest inventory of Sternberg's 3 components applied to your own relationship, rather than to a Renaissance play or a Vietnamese legend. How much time have you actually had with this person outside of moments of crisis, secrecy, or urgency? Not how intensely you feel about them, but how much ordinary, boring, unremarkable time you've logged together, waiting in lines, being tired, being annoyed by something small, seeing each other on a day when nothing dramatic was happening at all. If the honest answer is almost none, that isn't a reason to panic or to end things immediately. It's a reason to notice that you are, structurally, closer to where Romeo and Juliet were standing than where Ba and Kuang were standing, and to treat the intensity you're feeling as interesting rather than as proof. Next, look honestly at how you behave when the obstacle in front of you gets worse. Do you find yourself clinging harder, needing more reassurance, feeling a spike of panic at any hint of distance? Do you find yourself pulling back, minimizing how much this actually matters to you, quietly preparing for a loss you haven't experienced yet? Neither response makes you broken, and neither response is a moral failing. They're patterns, and patterns that were laid down a long time ago, often long before you ever met this particular person, can be worked with once you can see them clearly. Naming which pattern you tend toward, out loud to yourself or to a therapist or even to the partner you're worried about, is itself the first step toward responding differently than the pattern would otherwise predict. Then, check yourself against Peele's markers honestly, the same ones Lynn's composite story in this video failed to clear. Has your tolerance for contact and reassurance been steadily increasing, so that what used to feel like enough no longer does? Has your life outside this relationship, your friendships, your work, the things you used to care about independently, been quietly shrinking to make more room for it? And when things get hard, does the difficulty make you want to hold on tighter rather than take stock? If you recognize more than one of these in your own situation, that isn't proof your relationship is doomed or wrong. It's information, the same kind of information Peele spent his career trying to get people access to before it was too late for them to use it. Look, too, at your social scaffolding. The variable Sinclair's research says matters more than almost anything else this video has discussed. Who outside the two of you actually knows both of you and supports this relationship? If the honest answer is nobody, or almost nobody, that is not a reason for despair, but it is a project, an active piece of work that has to happen deliberately, the way DM built it over 5 patient months, and the way Wah and Phuc had to build it entirely from scratch in a new city. Relationships that exist in total isolation from any wider support network are not automatically doomed, but they are carrying a weight that relationships with real scaffolding don't have to carry alone. And pretending that weight doesn't exist doesn't make it lighter. And finally, ask yourself the question this video has been circling since the very beginning. Is there something you haven't said to this person or to someone else in your life because the moment has never quite felt right? A fear you haven't voiced, a doubt you've been sitting on, a piece of your own internal experience that the other person would probably want to know, and that you've been quietly withholding, not out of malice, but because saying it feels risky, or because you've told yourself there will be a better time later. Chau Thu's entire body of clinical work rests on one observation, restated in a dozen different forms throughout this video. The gap between what's true and what's known is rarely closed by a single dramatic conversation. It's closed or left open one small honest sentence at a time. In the ordinary days when closing it doesn't yet feel urgent, waiting for the moment when it becomes urgent is exactly how Romeo ended up standing over a tomb with poison already in his hand, and exactly how a friendship, a marriage, or a family relationship you care about can drift, quietly, sentence by unsaid sentence, into a gap too wide to cross. You do not need a feud between two houses, a stolen crossbow, or a family taboo going back 4 generations to find yourself living some version of this story. You need only the same, far more ordinary ingredients that show up in nearly every relationship eventually. A piece of information one person has and the other doesn't. A feeling neither person has said out loud. A moment that felt inconvenient to bring up and then became a habit not to bring up. Repeated often enough that it hardens into silence. The tomb in Verona is dramatic. The version of this most people actually live through is quiet, incremental, and almost invisible, until the day the gap turns out to have mattered more than anyone realized while there was still time to close it. If this video has done its job, you're leaving it with something more useful than sympathy for 2 dead teenagers in a play. You're leaving it with a working vocabulary for the particular kind of danger that hides inside the most intense feelings you will ever have, and a short practical list of questions you can actually ask yourself tonight about the relationship that matters most to you right now. Use it. Not to become suspicious of every strong feeling you'll ever have again, but to hold your strongest feelings the way a careful person holds anything valuable and unverified, with real appreciation for what it might be, and enough honest scrutiny to find out what it actually is before you build the rest of your life on top of it. Verona is 400 years away. Chau is 2000. The desert where Majnun wandered is older still. But the gap they were all describing, the space between what 2 people know about each other and what's actually true, is sitting in your relationships right now, today, in whatever ordinary, undramatic form it happens to be taking in your life. You don't need a balcony, a crossbow, or a bronze statue to close it. You need one honest sentence, said to the right person, before the moment for saying it quietly closes on its own. A final note on the modern version of this story. It's worth saying plainly, before this video ends, that none of this belongs only to the past. The specific tools of obstruction have changed shape since Verona and Chau, but the underlying pattern hasn't moved an inch. A parent today doesn't need to lock a daughter's identification papers in a drawer to exert the same kind of pressure DM's mother exerted. A shared family group chat, a location sharing app installed for safety, a monthly bank statement a parent still has access to, long after a child has technically become an adult, can all perform the same function. A 16th century household, once performed with raised voices and physical walls. The instinct to control who a person loves has outlived every single technology invented since Shakespeare's time, simply because it keeps finding new tools to wear. And the same is true of the intensity that obstruction produces. A relationship carried out mostly through late-night messages, hidden from a family that would disapprove, checked compulsively for a reply, the way DM once described checking for Kai, running on the adrenaline of secrecy rather than the steadiness of daylight, is not a modern invention. It's Romeo climbing the garden wall, translated into a phone screen instead of a wooden ladder. The specific danger Driscoll and Davis measured in 1972, and that Dutton and Aron demonstrated on a bridge in the same decade, doesn't care whether the obstacle is a feud between two houses or a family member who's added themselves to your social media as a quiet, ongoing form of surveillance. The nervous system responds to the shape of the danger, not to the century it happens to be living in. If anything, the modern version of this story carries one additional risk that Shakespeare's Verona never had to contend with: the sheer speed and volume at which secret relationships can now be conducted. A message can be sent and answered in seconds, at any hour, from any distance, which means the compulsive checking, the need for constant reassurance, the tolerance curve Peele described, where more and more contact is required just to maintain the same baseline of calm, has more raw material to work with than it ever did when a letter took days to arrive by hand. This isn't a reason to distrust every relationship conducted partly through a screen. It's a reason to apply exactly the checklist this video just gave you, with slightly more vigilance, because the tools available today make it easier than ever to mistake constant contact for genuine intimacy, and harder than ever to notice when a relationship has quietly become the only thing regulating how you feel. None of this changes the 3 lessons this video has already given you. It only means the gardens have moved online, the crossbows have become smartphones, and the letters that fail to arrive in time now sometimes fail to arrive because of a dead battery, a blocked number, or an algorithm that decided not to show someone a message at all, rather than a quarantine in a neighboring city. The mechanism is exactly the same, only the props have changed. So here, one last time, is the question this video opened with. Why does Romeo and Juliet still break the world? Because every generation, in every century, with whatever tools happen to be available to it, keeps finding new ways to fall into the exact same gap. The space between what's true and what's known, between what someone feels and what they've actually said, between the message that was meant and the message that arrived. Shakespeare didn't invent that gap. He just described it more beautifully than almost anyone since, and left it standing there, open, for every new generation to recognize as their own. Thank you for staying with this all the way through. If you take one thing from these last few hours, let it be this: the story that's been making people cry for 400 years isn't a story about how to love. It's a story about what happens when you don't get the chance to say the thing that mattered in time. You still have that chance right now with whoever you're thinking of. Don't wait for the letter to fail to arrive on its own.